Chapter 1034. Li Yi sat in the yard and spent a long time to calm down. He had once reached the peak of his life. Although it was very short and fleeting, he would always remember the feeling at that time. After being humiliated by Mississippi Lu for so long, at that moment, he finally completed a beautiful counterattack. Of course, it felt good, but the price he paid was painful. He was chased by Mississippi Lu for a few miles. This time she did not spank his butt again, but directly hit his laughing acupuncture point. When the two of them walked back, she looked at him and smiled all the way. However, it was not without gains. Li Yi still vaguely remembered that before the two of them got drunk last night, he seemed to have reached an agreement with her. She promised him that they would hook up. Although she was still not that gentle to him, at least, she would not do something as shameful and exciting as spanking his butt. This was a great improvement, and it was worth being happy about. The smile on Li Yi's face just appeared on his face, but he immediately stopped. He held his stomach, and his face twitched. He laughed for too long in the morning, and now his stomach hurt when he laughed. Although he did not know what happened after that, and why he ran to Mississippi Lu's bed, this was not important. Anyway, nothing that should not have happened happened. The only regret was that she finally got drunk yesterday. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and it was really a pity that he did not get any secrets from her. The inspiration for this idea came from Mississippi Lu. Last time when he was drunk, she even asked those virtuous and artistic teachers, and said that she already knew all his secrets. She did ask a lot of things, but if he said that he did not have any secrets with her, Li Yi would not believe it. Did she know that he actually came from another world? Did she know why he was always mischievous in front of her? She did not know anything. Xiaohuan walked out of the room and looked at the strange expression on the young master's face. She asked curiously, "Young master, did something happy happen to you this morning?" No. Li Yi would not admit that it was because Mississippi Lu hit his laughing acupuncture point. And he said seriously. Xiaohuan said in disbelief. But young master smiled the whole morning. No means no. Xiaohuan did not ask about this matter, and asked again. Then where did young master sleep last night? Last night. Li Yi thought for a moment and said, I slept with Fong. Xiaohuan looked at Fong, who came in from outside the door, and asked, Uncle Fong, right? Old Fong was taken aback. He looked at Li Yi, then at Xiaohuan, and nodded. Yes, that's right. Xiaohuan looked at Fong and said, I haven't asked Uncle what you said. Yes. Old Fong looked left and right, then clasped his hands behind his back and walked away. Who sent you to my side? Uncle Fong, he. Li Yi stared at her and said, Who sent you to my side? Uncle Fong, he. Li Yi glared at her and said, What's there to ask? You didn't open the door for me last night, so I had to squeeze with Fong. Otherwise, where else could I sleep? With the second miss. Li Yi looked at Mississippi Lu, who came out of the room, and asked, Don't you think so, Rui? Mississippi Lu glanced at him and walked straight out of the yard without saying anything. Oh. Xiaohuan nodded, looked at the yard door and asked, But young master, why is the yard door broken? Li Yi knocked on her head and said, Why do you have so many questions? Are you 100,000 wise? He was stunned after he said it. This scene and this sentence, why did it have a sense of déjà vu? Xiaohuan covered her head and said, Then I won't ask anymore. I'll tell a joke to young master. The second miss asked me to tell more jokes to young master. Li Yi couldn't help shivering and felt a dull pain in his stomach. He covered his ears and said, I won't listen. Xiaohuan hugged his arm and said coquettishly, a young master, just listen. I won't listen. Then I'll tell my joke. Young master just won't listen. The little servant girl was not obedient. If the soft approach didn't work, he had to use the hard approach. He pressed Xiaohuan on his thigh and spanked her butt. She never mentioned the joke again, and ran away with a red face in her butt. Watching her run away, Li Yi sat in the courtyard and let out a long sigh. People say that a moment of the night is worth 1,000 gold, but 1,000 gold can't buy an inch of time. Time flies like an arrow, the sun and moon shuttle. It's all about the preciousness of the wedding night. 1,000 gold can't buy an inch of time. Time flies like a rice dumpling. But the first time he had the wedding night, he was dragged up the mountain by Mississippi Lu and spent it in a daze. That night, he was shocked by Rui breaking the wooden table with her palm. The second time he had the wedding night, he was rolled up like a dumpling and couldn't move. The night of the night was wasted just like that. He must have owed Mississippi Lou a lot of money in his previous life, the kind that even 2,000 gold wouldn't be enough. Rui, Ruaching and Zuma were really too much. They didn't know when to be modest. Was the wedding night the time to be modest? Kong Rong let them be? This time, not only did he not make up for the regret of the wedding night, but he had even more regrets. Li silently swore in his heart that the next time, the time after that, it must be perfect. Thinking of the next time, the time after that, he was a little happy again. And then his stomach began to hurt again. Mississippi Lou walked in from outside and sat opposite him. When Li saw her, his stomach hurt even more, and he subconsciously became vigilant. He immediately said, "What are you trying to do? Don't think that you can do whatever you want just because you're beautiful, and you can go back on your word. You promised me last night." "I promised you last night I won't." Mississippi Lou looked at him and said, "I won't spank your butt, and I didn't break my promise." Li thought about it. She didn't break her promise, but her methods were even more ruthless. He really shouldn't have said so much last night. There was a lot of meat on her butt, and it was exciting to be spanked. It's over, it's over. Li quickly dispelled this thought from his mind. After spending so much time with Fong, he felt that he seemed to have been infected by him and had become a masochist. Mississippi Lou thought about it, stared at him, and said, "I have a question to ask you." "What question do you have again?" Li looked at her and asked warily. Then his expression froze. Why did he say again? Mississippi Lou rubbed the space between her eyebrows, stared at him and asked, "Other than this, did I say anything else to you last night?" "No, right?" Li actually didn't know. He really forgot. Even Rui Lu, the always drunk, had forgotten everything after getting drunk. How could she expect him to remember? Wasn't she thinking too highly of him? Mississippi Lou looked at his expression and asked again, "You really don't remember?" Li shook his head. "I don't remember. It's better to drink less in the future. It's not good for your health, and it'll make things worse." "Then it's okay." Mississippi Lou finally felt relieved. She waved her hand, stood up, and left. She felt that he said a very rare truth. Don't be greedy when you drink, because when you're drunk, you don't know what you'll say and what you'll do. She actually asked him who was prettier between her and Emingzu. She actually said, "They don't want it, but I want it." She actually asked him the biggest secret that she learned from him that night. She actually slept on the same bed with him for the whole night. Fortunately, he didn't remember any of this. Wait a minute. Li suddenly stood up, and a look of realization appeared on his face. He looked at Mississippi Lou and said, I remember everything." Hearing Li Yi's voice, Mississippi Lou stopped in her tracks. Her body stiffened, and her heart began to beat wildly uncontrollably. She turned around, looked at him, and asked calmly, "What did you remember?" Her expression was indifferent, and her fists, which were hidden in her sleeves, were clenched tightly. Even she didn't realize that her voice was slightly trembling. Of course, Li didn't realize that Rui's voice was trembling either. In his heart, he gave him 100 thumbs up for his wit. Opportunities always came to those who were prepared. Without a doubt, this was an opportunity. He looked at Mississippi Lou, thought for a moment, and said solemnly, "Last night, you said that you'll be gentler to me in the future. You won't speak loudly to me, and you won't bully me from time to time. You also said that you'll prepare an expensive gift for me during holidays and birthdays. Also, you said that you'll be nicer to me, that you'll massage my shoulders and back when I'm tired, and cook noodles for me when I'm hungry." Chapter 1035. You have to listen to me in the future. You have to help me when Emingzu bullies me. You can't be on her side. After listening to him for a quarter of an hour, Mississippi Lou closed her eyes and let out a long sigh of relief. She asked, "Anything else?" "Of course. You said Emingzu." Mississippi Lou's eyes suddenly opened. A trace of panic flashed across her pretty face. Her heart began to beat wildly again. What happened to Emingzu? You said Emingzu was too much. How could she bully others like that? Li thought for a moment and nodded. He looked at her and said, "Yes, that's what you said. You said that when we return to the capital, you will personally spank her to avenge me. I promise you that." Mississippi Lu took a deep breath and crossed her arms. She looked at him and asked, "Anything else?" Li thought for a moment and said, "Yes, but I can't remember it now. We'll talk about it when I remember it. You should do what you promised first." He suddenly felt some admiration for himself, so much so that he prostrated himself in admiration. Anyway, Rui was drunk last night. He didn't remember what happened. It was up to him to make up stories. If he didn't have a little conscience, he would directly tell her that she violated his body last night and ask for more compensation and privileges. Second Lady Lu did not speak. Li looked at her and suddenly asked, "You are the chief of the Wulin League. Your words carry enormous weight. What you say is like spilled water. You won't go back on your word, will you?" "No." Mississippi Lu smiled and shook her head. She said softly, "Why would I? I'll keep my word. Are you hungry or tired? Let me massage your shoulders first. Do you want to cook a bowl of noodles for you first?" Happiness came so suddenly that Li couldn't believe it. He suspected that he was dreaming and that he was still lying on the bed with Mississippi Lu. "Let's massage the shoulders first," Li said after some thought. It wasn't until he was lying on the rocking chair with Mississippi Lu's hands roaming around his shoulders that he finally accepted reality. She actually believed it. She really believed it. Li could already imagine the beautiful life in the future. He took a deep breath and said, "I didn't use enough strength, use more strength." Mississippi Lu smiled and said, "Okay." Outside the door, Feng saw with his own eyes that Xiao Huan went out. Only then did he come out from behind a big tree, ready to ask the son-in-law what they were talking about. As a qualified follower, he needed to have this kind of awareness. Even if the son-in-law said that he slept with him last night, he had to convince himself that he wasn't hugging two women last night. It was the son-in-law who was hugging him last night. For the son-in-law, for the young miss, for the second miss, for a perfect family. He felt that he was very great at this moment. Perhaps his back was shining with colorful light like that of Lady Ruoqing. When he walked to the door, he heard screams coming from the yard. "You use too much strength. It hurts, it hurts. Be gentle, be gentle." This was the voice of the son-in-law. "I haven't used any strength yet. Just bear with it a little longer. It won't hurt in a while." This was the voice of the second Mississippi. Feng stopped in his tracks and stood there for a while. Then he turned around and strode away. "It's just a joke. Why are you so serious?" His bones were almost broken by her. Li rubbed his shoulders and said, "I forgot. Tell me, what else did you say last night?" "Nothing." Mississippi Lu clapped her hands and asked, "Do you still want to eat noodles?" "No." Li Yi's attitude was very firm. He almost dismembered himself by rubbing his shoulders. If he asked her to cook another bowl of noodles, he might directly poison himself to death. It was better not to take this risk. In the end, he didn't ask what Mississippi Lu said last night. Rui Ruoqing and Zimo disappeared in the morning. He didn't know if it was some custom or something else. Some of the customs of these women, Li didn't know much. Feng walked in from outside and sat opposite him. Looking at him, he sighed and said, "Son-in-law, as a man, you have to be responsible for what you do. If you dare to do it but don't dare to take responsibility, you are not a man." Li turned to look at him and asked, "Responsible? What responsibility?" Feng thought for a moment and said, "Son-in-law, if you don't want to take responsibility, you can let the second miss take responsibility. It's the same anyway." Before leaving, he patted Li Yi's shoulder and said earnestly, "Son-in-law, you are destined to be unable to escape the clutches of the second miss in this life. Be optimistic and accept your fate. Life is like being raped. If you can't resist, then enjoy it to the fullest. This is my shallow opinion in this life. Take your time to understand." Feng always had a deep understanding of life, but he was wrong about one thing. Life was indeed like being raped, but he didn't think of resisting. The architectural style of the Jiang of Silla mansion was from the inside to the outside, from the master to the servant. The innermost courtyard was where the master of the mansion lived. It could be counted as Rui, Ruoqing, Zimo and himself. Of course there were also Xiaohuan, Xiaozhu and Xiao Chui's rooms. Yongning had the most freedom and could sleep wherever she wanted. There was also a study without a bed. Li Yi thought that he already had Rui and Zimo and Ruoqing, so there was no need to put a bed in the study. Only now did he realize how naive this thought was. If that was really the case, he wouldn't have spent the night with Mississippi Lu. Be careful, just put it in that corner. Fong moved the mattress in alone. Li Yi looked around and picked a corner that was pleasing to the eye. Fong put the bed in place and looked at Li Yi with a strange gaze. In this courtyard, there were eldest Miss, second Miss Zimo, Miss Ruoqing, Xiaohuan, Xiao Chui and Xiaozhu, the three servant girls. Son-in-law could sleep in any of the rooms, but he actually wanted to sleep in the study. Son-in-law couldn't be unable, right? At such a young age. How could he? Li Yi looked at him and said seriously, "If you look at me like that again, I'll send you to the Wu Kingdom to gather intelligence and come back in a few years." Fong clapped his hands and turned to walk outside. When he reached the door, he poked his head in and said, "Son-in-law, remember to eat more chives and kidneys. If you really can't do it, you can also use tigers or deers or something to make wine. Get lost." Fong left. When he left, he didn't forget to close the door. Li Yi soaked his feet and took off his shoes before lying on the bed and wrapping himself in the blanket. From yesterday until now, he hadn't had a good sleep. In the morning, he was chased by Mississippi Lu for a few miles, and on the first day of his wedding, he had to be alone in his room. He didn't have the mood to complain anymore, and was overcome by waves of tiredness. After sleeping for an unknown period of time, the door was suddenly pushed open and gently closed. On the bed, Li Yi's eyes suddenly opened. In the middle of the night, who came to his study? A thief? Impossible. Even if he was a grandmaster, he would not be able to sneak in here. Could it be Rui? Or a rapist? Was it Rui who came to pick up flowers? While Li Yi's mind was running wild, the figure had already reached the bed, quietly took off his shoes and climbed onto the bed. Li Yi's eyes widened. Could it be that the rapist was taking the initiative to offer himself? The moonlight shone in from the window, and Li Yi could roughly see the figure. From the shape of the chest, it was not Rui, but Zimo who came to pick up flowers. Chapter 1036. She shut him out on the wedding night, and now she wanted to secretly pick flowers. Li Yi really didn't expect that Zuemo would be so interested in this. Did she really think that she could get on and off his bed as she pleased? He closed his eyes and waited for her to pick flowers. However, after waiting for a long time, the person beside the bed did not move. Just when Li Yi was about to get impatient, he felt that she stood up. Was she going to run away? Li Yi couldn't pretend anymore. He grabbed her hand and dragged her to the bed. Ah! There was a cry of surprise in the room. Li Yi hugged her tightly and said fiercely, "Since you are here, don't leave." Shoo! After she reacted, she immediately looked back and whispered, "I sneaked here, they don't know." Li Yi carried her to the bed and whispered, "What are you doing here, picking flowers?" In response to him was a hot kiss. Li Yi had seen what a passionate Zuemo was like. In the dark night, there was only breathing and two gradually hot bodies. Li Yi knew what she was here to do. She was here to make up for the regret of the wedding night, and carry out the last step they didn't finish yesterday. Squeak! There was a sound at the door again. Zuemo was startled and immediately lay down inside, hiding in the quilt. Li Yi looked at the figure who quietly closed the door with some surprise. He thought to himself that it couldn't be. Two flower thieves came in one night. It seemed that he should carefully consider Fong's suggestion just now. The person who sneaked in was easy to recognize. From the way she walked and the hazy figure, it was Ruoqing. When Ruoqing walked to the bed, she saw him sitting on the bed. She was shocked and said after a long time, You haven't slept yet." "What do you mean by you, me?" Li Yi pulled her over and said, "Call me husband." Someone gently pinched his thigh. "Husband," she called out softly, and Li Yi could feel that her body was getting hot. Yesterday, I didn't mean to." Ruoqing was not as passionate as Zuemo. Her voice was so soft that it was almost inaudible. She said, Tonight, I will come to accompany you. Don't tell Zuemo or she will laugh at me." "Don't worry, I won't laugh." A familiar voice suddenly sounded. Ruoqing was startled. Seeing the figure crawling out from under the blanket, she was startled and then said in panic, "Zumo, you. What do you mean by you? You snuck over without telling me. Tomorrow I'll punish you according to the family rules." Ruoqing hurriedly stood up and said, I'll go first." Li Yi grabbed her wrist and gently pulled, causing her to fall onto the bed again. Li Yi held her slender waist and said softly, "It is fate that brought us together. Why don't we stay together?" He slept soundly when he had someone by his side. It was just that his arms were a little numb because they were pillowed on each side. When he came out of the study, it was already late in the morning. Fong was working in the yard, moving the stone table and stone bench to a place further away from the swing. When he saw Li Yi, he stopped in his tracks, thought for a moment, and asked, "Young master, do you really not need to ask the kitchen to fry another chives?" No matter whether others believed it or not, he really just hugged them to sleep last night. Nothing that should have happened did not happen, and nothing that should have happened did not happen. If it was only Zuamo or Ruoqing, the situation would naturally be different. However, the situation last night was special. The two women did not even take the first step, and the second step naturally could not be rushed. That was a matter for the future. Even though he knew that if he made some kind of request, they would not refuse for them. This was something that would be unforgettable for the rest of their lives. He should not be so hasty. However, what old Fong said made sense. After all, it was better to be on the defensive than to be on the defensive. Li Yi thought for a moment and nodded. "Let's fry one. Remember to fry them together with the kidney." In the early years of the Jingping era, the number of merchants settling in Suzhou began to increase rapidly. The flow of people in Yong County skyrocketed. The originally sparse streets gradually became lively and prosperous. This series of changes had long changed the people from the initial joy and excitement to numbness. Under the governance of His Highness Jiang of Silla, Suzhou would only get better and better. This was something that they never doubted in their hearts. Ever since the situation in the fringe changed dramatically, the bandits were almost completely eradicated. A smooth trade route was opened up, which was known as the Great Mountain Road. The merchants of the Three Kingdoms also benefited greatly from this. This was a region that was not under the jurisdiction of the Three Kingdoms. However, the fringe also had its own rules: freedom, equality, justice, and the rule of law. The fringe, which used to make people pale at the mere mention of its name, had completely changed in just over a year's time. The public security was good, even better than that of the various prefectures. The name Fringe no longer lived up to its name. The caravans traveling on the Great Mountain Road preferred to call it New World. There were even many large caravans that had set up shops and workshops in the mountains for convenience and safety. Of course, these were built on the foundations of the original towns in the mountains. Before this, no one knew that there was such a paradise in the desolate mountains in the Jiang of Silla's mansion. Fong leaned on the kitchen door and said, "Young master, we've almost cleared the road between the Qi Kingdom and the Jing Kingdom. The bandits we encountered along the way, other than those we chased away, have all been subdued. However, there are more hard to deal with near the Wu Kingdom. We don't have enough manpower for the time being, so it's a little troublesome to deal with them head-on." Li Yi was cooking fish, Drunk Mo's favorite steamed fish. When he heard that, he said casually, "Let's put off the trouble for now. We'll talk about it when we can spare some manpower." Watching the young master carry the steamed fish out, Fong swallowed his saliva and shook his head. Ever since the wedding, the young master had been indulging in the land of love and tenderness all day long. He didn't even care about proper business. The spring night was short, and the sun rose high in the sky. From now on, the Jiang of Silla would never get up. After the steamed fish was done, there was only Mississippi Lou's favorite dish left. Li Yi returned to the kitchen, wondering if he should make himself a dish of stir-fried kidney with chives later to nourish himself. He had been a little too depraved in the past 2 months. Even if it wasn't for the sake of becoming a martial arts master to avenge Mingzhu's letter, for the sake of a happy life in the future, he had to train harder and strengthen his physique. Try this. And this. He couldn't favor one and discriminate against the other. Including Mississippi Lou, he picked up a mouthful of food for everyone at the table. Only then did Li Yi begin to eat. Li Yi watched Drunk Emo eat a mouthful of fish, and then her expression became a little strange. He was very clear about his cooking skills. Li Yi picked up a mouthful of fish himself. It tasted very good. He looked at Drunk Emo and asked, "What's wrong, doesn't it suit your taste?" "No," Drunk Emo said. Her face turned pale, and she immediately ran away. Before Li Yi could react, the sound of retching came from outside the door. Li Yi looked at Rui and Rui watching and asked, "Is it that bad? I'll go out and see her." Without waiting for them to answer, he immediately ran out. Rui picked up a mouthful of fish and tasted it. A puzzled look appeared on her face. When she looked out the door, she was stunned, and then the expression on her face changed surprise, disbelief, and a trace of resentment. Outside the door, Drunk Emo leaned against the pillar. Her face was pale and she kept retching, but she didn't vomit anything. Li Yi hurriedly ran over, patted her back gently and said with concern, "What's wrong? I'll call the doctor." She shook her head and said, "It's nothing. I suddenly feel a little uncomfortable. I'll be fine after going back to my room to rest." "I'll help you back first." Li Yi helped her back to her room and let her lie on the bed. Then he asked, "Other than feeling nauseous, where else do you feel uncomfortable?" Drunk Emo said softly, "I still feel a little dizzy. Nausea, dizziness." Li Yi seemed to think of something. He grabbed her hand and suddenly asked, "You that, how long has it been since you last came?" "Which?" Drunk Emo looked at him in confusion. After understanding, her face turned red. She glanced at him and said, "How long has it been since I last came? You still don't know." Chapter 1037. Drunken Emo was pregnant. He was not prepared at all, let alone mentally prepared. In the beginning, he and Rui had gone through a lot in order to have a child. The old lady had taken her to worship Buddha many times and prayed many times. The two of them had also done a lot of hard work in private. After so much hard work, they had the current young master of the Li family, Li Duan. But he and Drunken Emo had been married for less than 2 months, and she was already pregnant. Judging from the time, it was very likely that it was the first time. When Li Duan was 1 year old, he and Rui had wanted to have a second child, but from a year ago until now, there had been no results. Therefore, he could understand Rui's happiness and the hidden bitterness in her eyes when she looked at him. Drunken Emo and Ruoqing were only 1 day apart. Li Yi held Ruoqing's hand and asked, "How is it? Do you feel uncomfortable anywhere?" Ruoqing asked in confusion, "What do you feel uncomfortable? That is, do you feel dizzy, nauseous, or something like that?" Ruoqing instantly understood what he meant. She blushed and whispered, No. Ruoqing and Drunken Emo were not mentally prepared to have children for the time being. They obviously had time to avoid danger, but there was no absolute safety in this kind of thing. God always liked to joke with him on this kind of thing. Drunken Emo was originally only her treasure, but now she immediately became the treasure of the whole family. As soon as Rui learned the news, she told him that he couldn't sleep with Drunken Emo at night anymore, and arranged 2 more obedient and sensible maids for her. The imperial doctor sent by Li Xian from the palace a long time ago naturally received a lot of money. Second Madame's pregnancy was a great thing for the Holy Family. From the housekeeper to the servants, everyone's monthly allowance this month was doubled. In addition, there was extra money. Even Li Duan knew that he was about to have a younger brother or sister. He ran around the courtyard happily. Ever since he left the capital in Xiaorui, not many people could play with him. Drunk Ink was now surrounded by them, and Li wasn't idle either. He had to send someone to inform third young lady Chen of this news. He also had to write a letter to report the good news to the old madam in Jingdo. He also had to send a letter to Tsing Shichen. He also had to write to Li Xian to remind him that even if he couldn't come, he couldn't miss out on a congratulatory gift. After writing a few letters, an hour had passed. When Li walked into the room, Zui Emo was alone by the bed, staring blankly ahead. Li sat down beside her and held her hand with a little force. Drunk Ink leaned on his shoulder and whispered, I'm scared." Li put his arm around her shoulder and lowered his head. "I'm here, don't be scared. It's not like you're the one giving birth to the child." Of course you're not scared. Drunk Ink rolled her eyes at him and leaned on his chest. The nervousness on her face faded a little. She blinked and suddenly smiled. Do you think our child will be a boy or a girl? Lee stroked her hair and said, if it's a boy, we'll protect you. If it's a girl, I'll protect you and your mother. Drunk Ink leaned lightly on his chest and murmured, you won't protect me. You only know how to bully me. When Rui was pregnant, Lee couldn't stay by her side from beginning to end. This had always been his regret. He couldn't make the same mistake a second time. He had already warned Wang Wei not to be impatient about the matter in the fringe. He told him to put aside the major forces that he hadn't subdued in the Wu Kingdom and focus on stabilizing the rear. As for the daily affairs of Shu Province, with Chen Chong around, there was no need to worry. Provincial Governor Chen's ability was unquestionable. When a woman was pregnant, there would be many symptoms, including dizziness, nausea, loss of appetite, and so on. In addition to physical problems, mental problems were more likely to occur. At this time, the company of the other half was especially important. Li would hug her to sleep almost every few nights. From dressing up to eating and sleeping, he wouldn't let anyone else interfere. This made Rui, who had always been gentle and generous, a little jealous. One night, after washing up, she leaned on the bed and said in a slightly sour tone, husband is so good to Sister Drunk Ink. I'm a little envious of her. Actually, Li had always treated them equally. It was impossible for him to treat them equally. But if he asked himself, he had never been partial to one person. Now that Drunk Ink was in a special period, there was no difference between how Li treated her and how he treated Rui at that time. He knew that Rui was just joking. He pulled her over and said, what's there to be envious of? When my wife gets pregnant, they'll be the ones envious of you. Rui sighed and said, how good would it be if I hadn't broken through to the Grandmaster level? It's okay. Li shook his head and said, Grandmasters aren't cabbages that you can pick and choose from. At most, we'll just try a few more times. How do we try? Li waved his hand to turn off the light. He leaned over to her ear and whispered, just like this. The light in the room dimmed, and the enchanting scenery in the dark couldn't be seen. Late at night, in a few rooms in the small courtyard, Ruaching and Drunk Ink had already fallen asleep. 2 rooms away, Mississippi Lu was lying on the bed when her eyes suddenly opened. In the dark, a blush quickly appeared on her face, and she quickly covered her ears with her hands. She covered her ears and covered her head in the quilt. The suppressed and extremely low voice could no longer be heard, but she felt a little hot. She tossed and turned on the bed and couldn't fall asleep. Each room had a separate shower. After taking a shower, Li carried Rui back to the bed and suddenly thought of a problem. He looked next door, then looked at Rui and asked, do you think they can hear us just now? Don't worry. Rui shook her head and said, the 2 younger sisters are already asleep. Li looked at her, and only felt that a Grandmaster was really powerful. It was simply a human-shaped eavesdropping device. He had to experience this feeling in this life. Then he realized one thing. Rui seemed to be only one step away from this realm. He looked at Rui and asked, what about Rui? Can she also hear us? This time Rui didn't say anything. Not speaking was a tacit agreement. He thought about it and asked Rui in a low voice, do you think it's a little inconvenient for Rui to live here? Rui closed her eyes and said softly, what do you want to say? Go and talk to Rui yourself. If he went to talk to Rui, he would be courting death. Li was not that stupid. Maybe Mississippi Lu went to bed very early every night. He closed his eyes and prepared to sleep. After a while, he opened his eyes again and turned to look at Rui. He asked, my wife can hear from so far away. Do you remember on the night of our wedding, when Rui and I were drunk in her room? What did she say to me? Anyway, they didn't do anything out of line that day. Rui knew about it. Li also just realized that Mississippi Lu didn't tell him what happened that night, but Rui probably knew. Rui thought about it and said, she made a promise with you that she wouldn't spank you anymore. And then? Li was refreshed. He then asked, I know this. What else did she say? And then, after a while, Rui said, then I fell asleep. What else did she say? You can only ask Rui herself. Li felt a little regretful. If Mississippi Lou remembered it herself, he wouldn't have to ask Rui. He held Rui's hand and whispered, "Let's sleep," Rui responded. After a long time she asked, "Do you know how old Rui is this year?" "Soon to be 20. Lee opened his eyes and said, "In a few years it'll be time for me to get married. I don't know which good man will get lucky." Chapter 1038. Mississippi Lou was almost 20 years old. Before Rui went to bed last night, she unintentionally asked this question. Lee then realized how fast time had passed. When she was riding on the horse and looking down at him, in his eyes, she was only equivalent to a young girl in her prime in the future. Perhaps there was a little rebellion and violence in adolescence. Of course, as she gradually grew up and matured, there was only violence left now. A 20-year-old girl, whether in the Jing Kingdom, the Qi Kingdom, or the Wu Kingdom, was definitely an old leftover woman. Even though the marriage law in the Jing Kingdom had been reformed a few years ago and was ahead of the other countries, it only delayed the marriageable age by a few years. According to the statistics of the Ministry of Revenue, the average age of marriage for a girl in the Jing Kingdom was 16 to 17 years old. Of course, this age could not be compared to the future, but compared to the Wu Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom, it was much more scientific. According to this data, not only Mississippi Lou, even Xiao Huan, Xiao Zhu, and Xiao Chui were left behind. However, Mississippi Lou should not care about other people's opinions. After all, she was a woman who wanted to be the king of the mountain bandits. Now that this dream had not been realized, as a heroine and the future king of the mountain bandits, how could she give up her dream because of a romantic relationship? However, what if Rui did not think so? What if she cared about other people's opinions? What if she felt that a man and a woman should get married when they are of age? What if she felt that a romantic relationship was the most important thing? A girl's mind was the most difficult to guess. Sometimes, Li could not even guess what Yongning was thinking, let alone Rui. He had to find a chance to ask her, otherwise he would not be able to put his mind at ease. When a girl grew up, it was indeed worrisome. Mississippi Lou woke up late today, even later than Li. Moreover, his complexion did not look too good. Li sat in the courtyard and looked at her. He asked with concern, "What's wrong? Did you not sleep well last night?" Mississippi Lou glared at him and didn't say anything. She continued her morning exercise in the courtyard. The morning exercise was actually Tai Chi that Rui had modified. Rui had now reached a bottleneck in martial arts. In Sue's words, diligent practice was no longer helpful for her to improve her realm. What she needed was an opportunity. Li didn't know much about opportunities. He only knew that practicing martial arts was like rowing a boat against the current. If you didn't advance, you would fall behind. If Rui didn't advance, he would advance, which was equivalent to Rui falling behind. As long as she stood still, he would catch up to her sooner or later. At that time, it was possible for him to surpass her in terms of martial arts. And then he could he. An expert was indeed an expert. His morning exercise was like a dance. The whole set of movements was very pleasing to the eye. After a quarter of an hour, Rui's morning exercise was over. Li placed the heated breakfast on the table. She washed her hands and walked over. Li sat opposite her and watched her eat. Rui usually didn't take the initiative to speak, so Li had to find a topic himself. Li looked at her slightly haggard face and asked, "You always look pale in the morning. Is it because you're not used to living here? Do you want me to move you to another courtyard?" Mississippi Lou took a small sip of porridge and looked up at him. There was a hint of inexplicable meaning in her eyes. Li couldn't help but feel a little guilty when he saw that look. Worried that she would misunderstand something, Li hurriedly explained, "Of course, if you think it's okay to live here, just pretend I didn't say anything. I'm not chasing you away, and I'm not saying you're unnecessary." Mississippi Lou ignored him and buried her head in her porridge. Li thought for a moment and asked, "Rui, you'll be 20 in a few days, right?" And then? Miss Lou glanced at him again and said casually. It was obvious that she was waiting for his next words. "I don't mean anything else." Li shook his head and said, "I just suddenly remembered that when Rui was 20, Dwayner was already born. You're not young anymore. When are you going to get married? Do you have any plans?" Guessing other people's thoughts was not a good thing. Lee decided to ask in a roundabout way. After getting an answer from Mississippi Lou, he felt a little more confident. Without waiting for Mississippi Lou to answer, he immediately said, "Of course, I feel that although family is important, a girl should still prioritize her career. You have Lu Meng in your hand and you're in charge of the fringe. You don't have to rush into getting married. Rui and I can support you." Mississippi Lou put down her bowl and wiped her mouth with a napkin. Then she looked straight at him. This made Lee feel even more guilty. After some time, Mississippi Lou suddenly retracted her gaze and said, "You're right. I'm already 20. If I don't hurry to get married, I'll be like Li Emingzu in a few years. No one wants me." Li looked at her and murmured, "Emingzu, she has someone who wants her." "What?" "Nothing." Mississippi Lou shook her head and said, "I don't want to be like Li Emingzu. Moreover, I have my own hands and feet. I don't need you and my sister to support me." Then, she looked at Li Yi and said, "Also, I forgot to tell you that I already have a sweetheart. He's handsome and his martial arts are not bad. He's in Lu Meng. I'll introduce him to you next time." I have a sweetheart." Li looked at her with his eyes wide open. His soul seemed to be hit by a speeding carriage. There was a slight tremble in his voice. Mississippi Lou nodded and said, "You and my sister don't need to worry. We'll get married when it's time." She stood up and said, "I still have something to do in the league. I'll leave first." Li stood up and took her small bowl. He said in a daze, "Don't you want another bowl?" "No." Mississippi Lou waved her hand and said, "The porridge you cooked this time was too sweet. Remember to put less sugar next time." Then she turned around and left. Her figure disappeared out of the door. Li held the empty bowl in his hand. His mind was blank. What Mississippi Lou had just said exploded in his mind like thunder. She had a sweetheart. She still wanted to get married. Did she ask for Rui's opinion? Did she ask for his opinion? Men nowadays couldn't be judged on the surface. There were a lot of sanctimonious beasts. What if she met a bad guy? She actually complained that the porridge he cooked was too sweet. She clearly liked eating sweet things. When did she stop liking sweet things? Li held the empty bowl and stood there in a daze. Outside the door, Mississippi Lou looked back. She turned back and the corner of her mouth curled up into an imperceptible smile. "Second Miss, good morning." Fong walked over from the side and waved his hand to greet her. "Morning." Mississippi Lou smiled at him and turned to leave. Fong's footsteps came to an abrupt halt. The expression on his face immediately froze. He looked at the sun above his head. There was no doubt that it rose from the east. Since the sun did not rise from the west, why did Second Miss smile at him? Could it be that Second Miss also thought that the new clothes he wore today matched him very well? After a long time, he shook his head and walked into the courtyard. Seeing Li standing in the courtyard, Fong walked over happily and asked, "Son-in-law, look at the clothes I'm wearing today. Don't I look very spirited?" Crash. The small bowl in Li Yi's hand fell to the ground and broke into several pieces. Fong looked at him in disbelief. Although he knew that the new clothes that Xiao Hong made for him looked very good on him, the son-in-law did not have to be so surprised, right? Li Yi picked up the broken pieces on the ground. Fong hurriedly said, "Son-in-law, these things can be done by the servants. Be careful not to cut yourself." The broken pieces in Li Yi's hand fell to the ground again. "I'll go get the medicinal wine." He looked at Li Yi's finger that was starting to bleed. He closed his mouth and turned to walk to the study. In a room in the inner courtyard, Xiao Huan changed the bed sheets on Second Miss's bed and put a new one on it. She picked up the pillow and patted it, but found a thin book under the pillow. Chapter 1039. The young maidservant was curious. The second young miss used to hate studying even more than she did. In the academy, she would often make old Sir Qin so angry that he couldn't breathe for a long time. Later on, old Sir Qin simply didn't let her go. But in the past 2 years, or more accurately after the Lantern Festival 3 years ago, the second young miss seemed to be possessed. Many times she spent more time reading books than practicing martial arts. She and the second young miss learned how to read from the son-in-law. Now she could recognize quite a few words. She shook her head and put the book back. But for some reason, she looked at it again. With just one look, she froze on the spot and opened her mouth in surprise. She already knew quite a few words, so she naturally knew what was written on the page. Mandarin duck handkerchief. She remembered that when she learned the words Mandarin duck, it took her a long time to remember it. She knew this book. She didn't know many books and couldn't even recite all 4 books and 5 classics, but she was very clear about the contents of this book. When the maidservants in the residence gossiped in private, they often mentioned this book. The title of the book was Mandarin Duck Handkerchief, but the contents had nothing to do with Mandarin ducks or handkerchiefs. This was a book that taught women how to pursue men. The book detailed the methods and steps for a woman to pursue her sweetheart, as well as how to test if a man liked her, and if he was worthy of her liking. For example, the method of loosening the reins in order to advance. When the maidservants said these things, she didn't really understand them. But when the maidservants said these things, she didn't really understand them. Instead, she said, "To make a man remember you, you must first make him feel pain. To make him remember you forever, you must make him feel pain deep in his heart. You can like a person's talent, his looks, or even his money. But if you like a person because he treats you well, then when he doesn't treat you well, you will have nothing." She understood 70 to 80% of these easy-to-understand words. This book had been banned by the government more than 10 years ago. The reason was that many people believed that this book was obscene and harmful to etiquette, so it was impossible to buy it on the market. However, many women would still keep a copy and keep it under their bed pillows. They would then pass it on to their close friends and treat the words in this book as priceless advice. It was said that the author of this book was an extraordinary woman. Because of her own experiences, she wrote this book to warn and teach all women in the world how to pursue the love of their lives and how to protect themselves. It was also said that the author of this book was a favored concubine deep in the palace. It was only because she had long seen through the love between men and women that she wrote this masterpiece. It didn't matter who the author of this book was. What mattered was Second Miss. Why did Second Miss read this kind of book? She flipped open the book and found that some notes had been made. She looked at the place where the notes were made and felt even more surprised. Who did the Second Miss like, and who did the Second Miss want to test? Li Yi's hand was only scratched by a broken piece of porcelain. The wound wasn't deep. After a simple cleaning and disinfecting, he didn't bandage it. Fong sat opposite him and looked at him with a burning gaze. He asked, "Son-in-law, do you have something on your mind?" Li Yi was silent for a moment. He looked at him and asked, "Have you been to the Lu Meng often recently?" "Quite often." Fong nodded. He was bullied by his own wife and couldn't fight back. He felt wronged and had to find a place to vent. "How is the Lu Meng recently? Did anything strange happen?" Fong thought for a moment and said, "Everything is fine. Nothing strange happened. It's just that a group of people passed the assessment some time ago. There are a few good seedlings among them. They look like humans, but I don't know if they are just embroidered pillows." Everyone whom old Fong described as a human or a dog was better looking than him. Fong actually wasn't ugly. Other than his body being a bit strong and his face being a bit naive, he was quite good looking. But that wasn't the main point. He looked at Fong and asked, "Do you feel that Rui has been acting strange recently?" "Second Miss." Fong thought for a moment, and thought of the strange smile she had shown at the door. He nodded and said, "Yes." Li Yi was silent for a moment and said, "Come with me to the Lu Meng." The number of core disciples in the Lu Meng has just exceeded 3,000. The number of masters on the 3 lists is also increasing every month. At this rate, it won't be difficult to reach 4,000 by the end of the year. The Lu Meng was located outside the county. It occupied a large area and was equivalent to a small town. Lu Luo walked beside him and introduced the recent developments of the Lu Meng. The Lu Meng had Su in charge and many masters on the heaven list. It was a great attraction for people in the martial arts world. The disciples who had passed through many rounds of selection were the best of the best. After Lu Luo finished introducing the recent developments in the Lu Meng, he pointed to a room in front and said, "The League Master is there. I will take you there." He pointed to the room. A woman put a letter on the table and said, "League Master, the situation in the Wu Kingdom is the same as before. The court and the rebel armies are still in a stalemate. There is no news of Princess Duanrong. The woman wore a tight white robe and was dressed like a man. Her hair was tied up in a bun similar to a man's. She had a valiant air about her. As the leader of the female army directly under the League Master, her strength was top and she was ranked in the top 10 of the heaven list. Although she was a woman, no one in the entire Lu Meng dared to look at her as a woman. I understand you, Mississippi Lu nodded. Suddenly her eyebrows moved. She took the initiative to hold the woman's hand and said, "You have worked hard. I know that you have admired Jiang of Silla for a long time, and have wanted to meet him for a long time. Coincidentally, you have encountered a bottleneck in your martial arts. Come back with me today and meet Jiang of Silla. At the same time, you can get some pointers from my sister." The woman looked down at their hands that were held together, and her face suddenly blushed. Somewhere in the Lu Meng, Fong looked in surprise at Li Yi and asked, "Son-in-law, why aren't you going to find second young mistress?" Li Yi shook his head and said, "I suddenly remembered that second madam's fish is still being steamed in the pot. If it is steamed for too long, it will not be tender anymore. We have to go back quickly." Inside the room, the woman looked down at the hand Mississippi Lu was holding her hand. Her face was red and she said in a low voice, "League Master you. I know." The woman was stunned. "You know?" Then, she lowered her head and her face became even redder. She said in a low voice, "I know that we are both women, and women should not like other women, but I know that you have long wanted to meet my sister and Jiang of Silla." Rui was stunned. He looked at her and asked, What did you just say?" Jiang of Silla Mansion. Li Yi was cooking in the small kitchen. Fong leaned against the door and looked at him worriedly. At a certain moment he suddenly said, "Son-in-law." Li Yi turned around and glanced at him, his face expressionless. "Does it hurt?" Fong asked. "What hurts? Where else does it hurt, son-in-law?" "It hurts. Your hand doesn't hurt." "Why does it hurt?" "Because you cut your hand just now." Fong finally understood. It was not the second young mistress who was strange, but the son-in-law. The son-in-law had been distracted for the whole day. He was cut by broken porcelain in the morning and cut his hand while cutting vegetables in the afternoon. This was something that would not happen even if he closed his eyes. "What's wrong with your hand?" At a certain moment, Mississippi Lu walked into the kitchen and looked at his bandaged hand. She frowned and asked. She looked up and saw that his eyes were confused and his expression was blank. Li shook his head and said, "It's nothing. I accidentally cut it." Mississippi Lu took a step forward. "How could you be so careless? Let me see. It's a small injury." Li took 2 steps back and asked, "Is someone here?" "Who?" "Your sweetheart." "Sweetheart?" Mississippi Lu glanced at him, and a strange look flashed in her eyes again. She said, "I was just joking with you this morning. How can I have a sweetheart?" "Joking?" Li looked at her in grief and indignation. He walked to the yard and pointed at the gigolo standing in the yard. He said, "I saw you holding hands today. Don't tell me that was also a joke?" "You misunderstood." Mississippi Lu looked at him and explained, "She's a woman." "Misunderstood? Woman?" Li was even more indignant. "Although I'm stupid, I'm not blind." Not only was he indignant, but he was also very disappointed. Did she think that he couldn't even tell the difference between a man and a woman? Was she so perfunctory now? He patted the gigolo's chest and said, "You said he's a woman. Where are her breasts? Where are her breasts?" The face of the gigolo, who was patted by Li Yi, turned from red to white and then to green. Mississippi Lu did not answer him. She thought for a moment and looked at him and asked, "Can you beat the 9th on the heaven list?" Chapter 1040. Can you beat the 9th on the heaven leaderboard? Mississippi Lu actually asked him if he could beat the 9th on the heaven leaderboard. Other than grief and anger, Li was even more heartbroken. How could she not know what he was capable of? The top 10 of the Heaven Road list was a group of perverts that were weaker than her and Ming Zhu. He did not lack experts, he did not lack great masters. He did not lack second great uncle who was even stronger than great masters. He even had a cheat that allowed him to level up in his sleep. But even so, he could not beat the 9th on the heaven leaderboard. As early as 2 years ago, the martial arts master ranking, especially the heaven leaderboard, had already turned into a sea of blood and corpses. With his current strength, if he was lucky, he could barely enter the top 20. Once the heaven leaderboard changed from 2 digits to 1 digit, the danger would increase exponentially. The 9th on the heaven leaderboard was an opponent that he could not fight head-on for now. When Lee thought of this, the sadness in his heart could no longer be described with words. Not only did she brush him off, but she also changed the topic. The method she used to change the topic was so unskillful. She really did not love him anymore. Apart from the sadness, Lee suddenly became vigilant. Murderous aura. There was murderous aura, strong murderous aura. He looked at the pretty boy beside him whose expression was even more sorrowful than his. He actually wanted to fight with him? Rui snatched his home. And he actually wanted to fight with him? Rui looked at the pretty boy, then pointed at Li Yi and said, "This is the Royal Highness Jiang of Silla that you always mention." The pretty boy's chest heaved a few times. His face was flushed and he calmed down a little. He gritted his teeth and said, "Nice to meet you, Royal Highness Jiang of Silla." Li Yi glanced at him and asked, "What do you mean nice to meet you?" The pretty boy was startled, and his chest began to heave again. "His name is Baisu." Mississippi Lu pointed at the pretty boy, looked at Li Yi and said calmly, "Baisu ha Baisu. Why not call him Baisha? A gigolo is a gigolo. He looks like a girl, his voice is girly, even his name is so girly." So, Li Yi was startled. He suddenly recalled something. Mississippi Lu seemed to have a subordinate named Baisu. She was the one in charge of the army of women. Before her, this position was held by Yangliuking. This showed how much Mississippi Lu trusted her. Li Yi looked at the pretty boy who was glaring at him. She had no beard, no Adam's apple, pierced ears, a feminine voice, and a feminine face, because she was a woman. He then looked at her chest. Although it couldn't be called a chest when she stood next to Rui, it did seem to protrude a little more than his. Li Yi felt that he was really blind. 9th on the heavenly roll. Indeed, one could not judge a book by its cover. Strength and breasts were not necessarily proportional. An extremely awkward expression surfaced on his face. "Hey, young Miss Bai, how are you?" Baisu snorted coldly. "What's good about it?" Everything was good except for her chest. Li Yi didn't know that a woman's chest could be so flat. Otherwise, he wouldn't have recognized it wrongly. It seemed that it was not entirely impossible that Hua Mulan had been in the army for so many years without being discovered. Li Yi glanced at her, and realized that she was still looking at him with her teeth clenched. This young Miss Bai was pretty, but her temper wasn't very good. Why did she bear grudges so easily? Mississippi Lu explained. "Baisu used to admire you. So, I brought her back today to let her meet the legendary Royal Highness Jiang of Silla." There were many women who admired him in the Jing Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom. Everyone knew that Royal Highness Jiang of Silla was handsome and well-versed in both literature and martial arts. Unfortunately, there would be one less today. After Baisu glared at him fiercely for a few times, he went to find Rui to ask questions about martial arts while Rui stayed behind. Mississippi Lu looked at him and said, "Let me see what's wrong with your hand." No. Li Yi rejected her decisively. If she said she wanted to see it, he would see it. If she said she had someone she liked, he would have it. If she said she didn't have it, he would lose face. If he agreed to these small things easily, he couldn't guarantee that she wouldn't ask for more in the future. Should he agree or pretend to resist before agreeing? "Will you give it to me?" "No." "Forget it then." Second Miss Lu shrugged her shoulders, then looked at him and said, "I lied to you this morning. How could I have a sweetheart?" "Swear." "Okay, I swear." Second young Mistress Lu raised her hand and said, "If I have a sweetheart, I will make him choke when eating, choke when drinking water, choke when eating fish, and choke when eating raccoons without seasoning packets." Mississippi Lu was very sincere in making such a vicious oath. However, she felt cold all over. Maybe she caught a cold because she didn't sleep well last night. She actually joked with him about such an important thing. Was this something she could joke about? In the past, Rui was as cold as ice and would draw her sword at the slightest provocation. But now, She had learned from some bastard to be so naughty, making jokes that shouldn't be made. His poor hand had been injured twice in one day. Lee walked towards the kitchen. He waved his hand casually and said, "It's okay. I just accidentally cut myself." Bang! His hand accidentally hit the door frame, and the gauze that was no longer bleeding was immediately stained red. Lee felt that he should look at the almanac or find a monk or a Taoist priest to calculate whether he had been in trouble recently. He actually experienced 3 bloody disasters in one day, Mississippi. Lu walked over quickly and grabbed his hand. She looked back at Fong and said, "What are you waiting for? Hurry up and get the gauze and medicinal wine." "Ah. Oh." Fong immediately reacted. This was the 3rd time he had taken these 2 things today. Watching Mississippi Lu take off the gauze and open the medicinal wine, Lee hurriedly said, "I'll do it myself. I'll do it myself." Mississippi Lu crossed her arms in front of her chest and said, "Do it yourself. I'll see how you do it yourself." Lee didn't have a 3rd hand, so he couldn't do it himself. He looked at Fong and said, "What are you waiting for? Come and help." Fong looked at Second Miss and then looked at his son-in-law. He leaned against the door frame and shook his head. "Sorry, I don't know how to do it." Lee looked at him and said in surprise, "You didn't return it in the morning and afternoon." "Sorry, I forgot." Fong continued to shake his head. Rebellion, rebellion. Fong actually embarrassed him in front of Rui. He didn't let him go to the Wu Kingdom to inquire about the news. "Don't be so wishy-washy. Let me do it." Mississippi Lu glared at him, grabbed his hand, and carefully washed it with the medicinal wine. Then she opened the gauze, cut a section, and carefully wrapped it. It had to be said that Rui's wound looked much better than Fong's. After wrapping it up, she put the gauze and medicinal wine aside. As if remembering something, she looked at Li Yi and asked, "Do you think a woman can really like another woman? Lesbians are infinitely good, but they can't give birth." "What?" Li Yi looked at the butterfly knot on his hand and felt awkward no matter how he looked at it. He said casually, "There's no law that says a woman can't like another woman, like a man or a woman, or even like a person or not. It's the freedom of others." As he spoke, a shocked expression appeared on his face. He looked at Mississippi Lu and said with difficulty, You can't be saying." Mississippi Lu looked at him and nodded solemnly, "You guessed right." Li stood rooted to the ground in a daze. He was able to guard against Ming Zhu. He was able to guard against the gigolo, but he was unable to guard against another woman. "No." He looked angry. He grabbed Mississippi Lu's wrist and slapped her butt twice. He said, "No, I don't agree. Your sister won't agree either. Just give up. You've grown up, haven't you? What do you mean you don't like women? Don't you like women too?" Fong stood at the door and looked at the scene in the kitchen. The green bristle grass in his mouth had already fallen to the ground. The sun was not scorching today, but he felt like he was blind. The son-in-law actually dared to do that to the second miss. He looked at the knife in the kitchen and was ready to grab it at any time. He was worried that the second miss would chop off the son-in-law's hand. "I'm just kidding. Don't be so serious, Mississippi." Lu shook off his hand and looked at the vegetables that had not been cut yet. She said, "Your hand is injured. Leave it to me. You go outside and wait." "Damn it. What the hell?" Fong couldn't help but curse in a low voice when he saw the son-in-law walk out of the kitchen unscathed. He picked up the green bristle grass on the ground and put it next to Li Yi's mouth. He asked son-in-law, "Tell me how you feel." "No, I don't feel anything." Li Yi's voice was a little shaky. Old Fong looked at his hands. Li Yi raised one of his palms, which were also trembling nonstop. He looked back at Mississippi Lu, who was wearing an apron and busy in the kitchen. He murmured, "What the hell?" Chapter 1041. Li Yi thought that the day of his wedding would be the pinnacle of his life. That day he spanked Mississippi Lu's butt to avenge his years of humiliation. Of course, the consequences of reaching the pinnacle were painful. His stomach hurt for several days, but after the paw sound, the carefree feeling that came from the depths of his soul was something that he would never forget for the rest of his life. This was something that no matter how much money he earned or how high his title was, it could not compare to. He thought that after that day, there would no longer be a pinnacle in his life. Who would have thought that after 2 months, he could easily reach the pinnacle of his life? Mississippi Lou did not beat him, nor did she scold him. She even helped him cut the vegetables and cook the rice. This was not Rui, this was Rui. After dinner, he sat in the yard thinking about this problem. Mississippi Lou sat opposite him. Lee could not help but shiver. He was ready to run away when she came to settle the score. Mississippi Lou looked at his fingers and asked, "What happened to you today?" Li Yi's 2 fingers were wrapped in gauze. He looked down, shook his head, and said, "I was accidentally distracted at that time." "What were you thinking about? You were distracted when you were cutting vegetables?" Mississippi Lou looked at him. Li always felt that her eyes were very aggressive, as if she could see through his mind. Well, I was thinking again. In the future, when I make porridge, I should put less sugar." Li nodded and said so. "Why less? Didn't you say that you don't like sweets?" "Who said that I don't like sweets?" Mississippi Lou looked at him and said, "I have always liked it." Li was a little happy. He knew it. He knew that Mississippi Lou still liked him and liked the sugar porridge he made. "Well, there is one more thing." Li thought for a moment, then looked at her and said, "It's too hot these days. We're going to move to the mountains for a while. Do you want to come?" It was already July. From a few days ago, the weather began to be unbearably hot. Of course, with the ice house and the ice mirror, it didn't matter whether the weather was hot or not. However, Li and Rui were worried that the coolness created by the ice would affect Zuemo's body. It just so happened that Wang Wei wrote a letter saying that it was very cool in the mountains these days. Li and Rui discussed it and planned to go there to avoid the heat, and come out when the weather was cooler. Go, why not? There are still some disobedient people there. It's time to subdue them. He and Zuemo would go there, and naturally, Ruoqing would not be missing. Xiao Huan, Xiao Chui and Xiao Zhu would definitely follow, and Li Duan, Yongning, and Mississippi Lou would not be left behind. So this time they should be going into the mountains to be bandits. Because Zuemo was pregnant, he was busy all day and had no time to arrange things there. It was said that his ancestors had bandit genes, so he managed this place in an orderly manner. He also built a prince's residence here. Although it was not as big as the Jiang of Silla's residence in Yong County, it was still the most magnificent building here. It could be said that he was very thoughtful. When they walked on the Bluestone Street, 2 people came from a distance with a man in custody. Li looked at the 3 people passing by and asked, "This is?" After Wang Wei went forward and asked, he came back and said, "These guys, they don't use the latrine. They always like to relieve themselves at the street corner. They don't change their ways, so I have to lock them up for 3 days before letting them out." Wang Wei actually liked to relieve himself anywhere in the past. Everyone was not particular, and there could be latrines everywhere in the mountains. But now that the prince was here, if these people made this place stinky, how could he, Commander Wang, put his face? Therefore, a few days ago he issued a death order. In the future, everyone's 3 urgent needs must be solved in the latrine. Those who disobeyed the order would be locked up and served. Li could understand his approach. Most of the people here were bandits, and they were used to being careless. When they were in the mountains, they were used to relieving their physiological needs anywhere. But it was really not possible here. On such a hot day, if everyone peed outside, the smell could be imagined. But thinking about it carefully, there was still a big loophole in this solution. Li thought about it and asked, "Is it useful to lock them up?" "It's useless." Wang Wei shook his head with a bitter smile and said, "These guys are used to being casual. They have always been like this. They would rather solve it outside the latrine than go in." Li waved his hand and said, "Since it's useless, there's no need to lock them up." If the punishment for urinating and defecating anywhere was not to work and still have food and drink, then this punishment was no different from a reward. Wang Wei was still too straightforward. If it was Fang, who was the traitor, then the problem of urinating and defecating anywhere in the stronghold would have been solved long ago. Wang Wei was startled and looked troubled. "But Your Highness, we can't just ignore it." Li shook his head. "Ignore it? Who said I don't want to?" Wang Wei turned his head and looked at the indifferent expression of His Highness. Suddenly, he felt a chill in his heart. In the confinement room, a man was brought in. He turned his head and said with a smile, "Old Wang, remember to bring me some beef noodles from Lu Ji's for dinner. Add more beef and more noodles. Add more chopped green onions and coriander." After saying that, he lay down on a bed in the corner and stretched comfortably. He put his hands behind his head. Boss Wang was really something. He just couldn't hold it in and had to be locked up for 3 days. However, 3 days was fine. 3 days was pretty good. He didn't have to work for 3 days, and he wouldn't starve. Never in his dreams would he have thought that there was such a good thing in this world. When he was released 3 days later, he would come back. As he was thinking about this, the door of the confinement room opened from the outside. A bald man stood outside and looked at him. He said, "Come out." "So soon?" He sat up from the bed with a hint of regret on his face. Could it be that Boss Wang had gone back on his word? However, the bald man didn't let him leave. Instead, he brought him to another place. Through the window, he could see more than 10 children sitting in seats with their hands behind their backs. They were swaying their heads along with an old man in front of them. He was a little confused. This was a school. He always felt that building a school in the stronghold was unnecessary. Only those with families would send their children here. Anyway, they didn't need to pay, so he just treated it as looking after the children. Why did this little bald man bring him here? To see which brat didn't study hard and beat him up. Chapter 1042. At the entrance of the academy, the young baldy looked at the man and said indifferently, "You will attend this class with them. If you can pass the exam for this class, then you can leave. If you can't pass, then you can only eat steamed buns and drink water today. If you can't pass today, then in the next 2 days, you will have to pass 2 more exams." The man was stunned. Like most of the people here, he had never been to school and didn't know a word. When he heard the old man shaking his head and talking, he dozed off. He didn't even know how to hold a brush. What kind of exam was this? He just peed. Was there a need to be like this? He pursed his lips, looked at the bald man and asked, "What if I still can't pass tomorrow?" "If you still can't pass." The bald man patted him on the shoulder and comforted him. In fact, steamed buns and plain water are the most nourishing. Although Commander Wang usually treated people kindly, many people were still afraid of him when he was serious. Not long after, the man walked into the school dejectedly and sat in the last row. The young bald man went forward and said a few words to the old teacher. The old man nodded and glanced at the back row. He didn't care about the man anymore. The man sat in the back row. When he saw the eyes of the children around him, his face was a little red. He simply lay on the table and slept. He really didn't believe that Boss Wang was crazy to let him sit in the school with these little children to study. Did he want him to be the top scorer? He, Wang Dazhuang, was not meant to be a scholar in his life. Listening to the old man's voice, he felt sleepy. After an unknown amount of time, he was pushed awake by a little fat man sitting next to him. The little fat man handed him a piece of paper and a pen and said, "The teacher said to write down the 5 words he just taught." The man looked at him with a dull face. Before writing it down, he needed to know what words the old man had taught him, how to write those words, and how to hold the pen. He looked at the little fat man, smiled and said, "How about you write one for me? I'll go out and buy you candied hawthorn. My family sells candied hawthorn." The little fatty looked at him and shook his head. "Also, teacher said that I can't write for him, or I'll be punished too." The man looked at him helplessly. "Then can you at least copy it for me?" "Not giving." The little fatty replied bluntly. He turned his back to her and began to write on his own. The man grabbed the brush and looked at the white paper on the table. His face was lifeless and he didn't know what to write. After a while, the pen in front of him disappeared, and so did the paper. In its place was a cup of water, a steamed bun and a bald head. The baldy looked at him and said, "Tomorrow is a poetry recitation test. The day after tomorrow is poetry recitation. The day after that, you might have to learn arithmetic." The commander said that the 5 words that you didn't write today have to be filled in. Take care. With that, he turned around and left. The man sat in his original position in a daze, reciting poems, writing from memory, calculating. They wanted him dead. The man shuddered and hurriedly ran out. He didn't see the baldy, but he saw the little fatty who stopped him from copying. The little fatty was licking a stick of candied hawthorn. The man snatched it from his hand and took a bite. He threatened, "Kid, write one for me tomorrow, or I'll beat you up." The little fatty didn't cry or make a fuss when his candied hawthorn was snatched away. He just turned around and looked at an 8 feet tall, muscular man behind him. He said, "Dad, he snatched my candied hawthorn and wanted to beat me up." A shadow suddenly appeared in front of the man. He raised his head and looked at the man who was much more muscular than him. He trembled and said, "Big brother, it's a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding my ass." It was much cooler in the mountains than outside, but there were more mosquitoes. Li and Drunken Mo couldn't compare to Rui and Rui. The mosquitoes would avoid them, so he could only make a few mosquito traps. Fortunately, they were very effective. Mississippi Lu stayed in the mountains for a few days before she went out with the Lu Meng's men. It seemed that she was going to sweep through the entire fringe. The fringe was actually very vast. They had only opened a trade route from the Qi Kingdom to the Jing Kingdom, cleared all the hidden dangers around the trade route, and had just started to advance to the periphery. Mississippi Lu set her sights on the entire fringe. Not only did she want to be the ruler of the New World, she also wanted to be the ruler of all the mountains in the fringe. What Li needed to do was to stabilize the rear, provide her with strategic support, resources, and be the man behind the scenes. On a hidden mountain, Li looked at the rows of towering buildings in front of him. Once again, he felt that Wang Wei was quite reliable. He had an entire library in his mind. He could do so many things with it. He could create many things that were considered black technology in this world. But he was only one person, and he was lazy. If he really wanted to accomplish these things, he would need to live for 500 years, and then borrow another 500 years from God. Perhaps a few hundred years would not be enough. Even if he had a lifetime of hundreds or thousands of years, it would still be impossible to bring out all the knowledge in his mind. Things like the technology tree should be left to Li Xian. He couldn't even handle Rui, so he had no interest in these things, but he didn't really want to waste his hard-earned cheat. After all, other than copying books, poems, and peeking at other people's diaries, this thing still had other uses. Li asked Wang Wei to open up an industrial area far away from the village. They would conduct research on things like iron smelting, coke making, and forging. Although it was called research, it was actually just him telling them to do it. These would be very useful in the future. Although they couldn't use it for now, it was better to be prepared. For the time being, this would be the breakthrough point. The rest would be developed slowly in the future. At the back of the classroom, in the corner of the back row, a man looked at the little fatty beside him and swallowed his saliva. He watched as the little fatty chewed on the chicken drumstick in his hand and said, "Little brother, when you come tomorrow, can you secretly bring me some salted vegetables?" He had been eating steamed buns and drinking plain water for 7 days. He had lost a lot of weight, and the reason for all this was because he had peed outside the toilet. He couldn't understand it now. The toilet was clean and tidy, and there was no smell after he flushed it. Why did he have to pee outside? This was despicable. The little fatty nodded with great difficulty. He immediately picked up a pen and pointed at a word on the paper with the tip of the pen. He asked, "Little brother, how do I pronounce this word? I've forgotten. Can you teach me again?" He felt extremely miserable. The school was really too scary. Even if he were to move stones outside, it would be better than sitting here and reading. The detention room not far from the school had also been transformed into a new school. In the past month, people who urinated, spat, and did not pay attention to hygiene were all caught and brought here. Here they didn't have to move stones, pave bridges, or repair roads. They didn't have to do anything. They could spend their days swimming in the sea of knowledge, experiencing the joy of reading. Haha, I passed. I can go out now. Suddenly, a person rushed out from inside and stood on the street, looking like a madman. After laughing, he looked down at his hands with a pained expression. These were a pair of hands used to chop people, but they had been used to write for the past few days. He wrote nonstop all night, and if he couldn't finish, he could only eat steamed buns and drink plain water. He wasn't even given a salted vegetable. Suddenly, a few hands reached out from the window. Someone exhorted loudly, "Brother, brother, come back. Stay for another 2 days and teach us too." That person stood on the street and laughed maniacally. "Even if I die outside, starve to death, suffocate to death, or jump off the mountain to my death, I won't go back." In a room somewhere in the stronghold, Commander Wang touched his bald head. He was surprised to find that in the entire stronghold, there hadn't been a case of people urinating, spitting, and littering everywhere for a long time. In the short span of half a month, this problem that had been troubling him for years had actually been cured. Chapter 1043. The group of people who were used to using the sky as their blanket and the earth as their bed, and eating, drinking and defecating on the bed suddenly became particular. No one peed or spat on the ground anymore. The village looked brand new. Wang Wei was once again impressed by His Royal Highness Jiang of Silla's wisdom. Setting up a school in the stockade was indeed useful. In the past, he had thought that it was superfluous. Now, it seemed that people who had been educated were indeed different. Those guys had only been in the school for a short period of time, but they had already become civilized and polite. When his child was born and grew up, he would also send him to the school and let the teacher teach him well. Li also heard about this from Wang Wei. He felt a little regretful. His subordinates were a group of boorish men. They would pick up a knife and cut people without hesitation, but when he asked them to pick up a pen and write, it was like asking for their lives. He gave them a free chance to improve themselves and surpass themselves, but none of them cherished it. Ning Yuan was unwilling to go back to the school, even if he moved stones to build bridges and roads. This made it impossible to implement the other ideas that Fang gave him. For example, they could be confined for half a month and sent food and water every day, but there was no toilet in the confinement room. Anyway, they were used to doing it on the spot. Another idea was to erect a monument in front of the village and engrave their names and heroic deeds on it for future generations to admire. Or forget it, it was too disgusting. No more examples. No one was willing to study. Even if they had to hold their urine to death outside, they were unwilling to go back to the school. Perhaps they had already realized that there was no end to learning, and that it was still possible to repent. But this also exposed a major problem. He was very short of high-end talents under his command. Just look at Second Miss Liu in the past, and you can see how much martial artists despised reading, not to mention those bandits. To put it bluntly, they were just a bunch of unruly people. They could swarm up and shout to kill, and they had some strength in repairing bridges and roads. However, when it came to management, or charging and breaking through enemy lines according to rules, they were far from being good at it. This was not what Li Yi wanted to see, nor was it what Mississippi Liu wanted to see. Mississippi Liu had left half a month ago to occupy more mountains. Before she left some of Lu Meng's people here to train Wang Wei's men. If it wasn't for the fact that life was really tough, no one would be willing to become a bandit. Many people were ordinary people before they became bandits, and they also had families to support them. After being subdued, some of them relied on their own efforts to earn a family business and brought their families here. Now this place was no different from an ordinary town. Li Yi selected a group of people who were educated and tried to cultivate some talents in other fields. Currently, he focused on industrial fields such as machinery and materials. Of course, he didn't need them to come into contact with advanced things. As long as he explained some simple theories, they would be able to understand and put them into practice. At this time, he started to miss Li Xian. The real talents that he needed were almost all in the Academy of Sciences. He still had to poach some people from his side. "Your Highness, it's done." Wang Wei strode in from outside with a pile of swords and knives in his hands. He threw them on the ground with a clatter. Li Yi stood up and walked to the front. Wang Wei picked up 2 knives from the ground and held them in his hands. He said, "Your Highness, look. This is an ordinary knife, and this one was just made by them." He waved both his hands at the same time. With a clang, sparks flew everywhere. The knife in his right hand was undamaged, but the one in his left hand had an obvious chip. Clang. He slashed twice again. The knife in his left hand broke into two pieces, but the one in his right hand was still intact. Feng, who had just walked in from outside, stared at the knife in Wang Wei's hand. His eyes lit up, and he muttered, "Treasure, treasure." Wang Wei looked at him and said generously, "You like it? If you like it, I'll give it to you." He handed the knife to Feng, but Feng did not take it. A hint of vigilance appeared on his face and he said, "What do you want? I can't afford to offend that tigress of yours. You didn't play cards with me yesterday. You'd better find another reason to fool her." "Oh, I didn't go back. What reason do I need? I'm not you even afraid of your wife. If you have the guts, say this again in front of her later. Why should I listen to you?" Li Yi ignored these two guys who were unwilling to admit the truth. He picked up the two swords from the ground and carefully examined them. After the improvement of the smelting and forging methods, the quality of the steel had indeed improved a lot. Although it was still far from the level of cutting through iron like mud, compared to ordinary weapons, it could already be called a treasure. Since it was a treasure, it could be sold for money, a lot of money. He was already very rich, but he had so many subordinates who needed to eat, invest in construction, and support his squandering sister-in-law, Rui. When it came to things like money, the more the better. Rui's autumn water was a good sword. In terms of sharpness and toughness, it was not comparable to the one in his hand. However, that sword must have been forged by a skilled master craftsman after thousands of tempering. Although it could be sold for a very good price, the cost was not low. Mass production was different. The technological reform and cost reduction allowed them to easily create divine weapons in the eyes of ordinary people. This was not a divine weapon, it was all money. In the Jing Kingdom, the richest people were in the capital. In the Qi Kingdom, the richest people were in the capital. After pondering for a moment, Li felt that it was time to let those foreign merchants from the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland out. No, I almost forgot. After the incident with Liuli, whether in the Qi Kingdom or the Jing Kingdom, if those foreign merchants dared to show up, they would be caught and dismembered immediately. This time he changed the method. He sat down at the table again and began to write to Li Xian. Hibiscus Garden, the capital. Li Xian held a dagger in his hand. He easily cut a few holes in the long saber of the opposite guard. He nodded with a satisfied look on his face. After sending so many gifts, that stingy guy finally knew to return the favor. This dagger was not bad. It was extremely sharp and exceptionally tough. Even the treasures in the palace could not compare to it. It could be called a divine weapon. It could be said that he was considerate. However, he soon realized a problem. This dagger was forged by him. In other words, he had mastered a new forging method. He did not tell me. I have done everything for him, but he kept it from me. There was a look of indignation on his face. If it were not for the heavenly weapon, he would not have ordered for him to find the best blacksmith in the Jing Kingdom. At some point, the guard behind him bowed slightly. "Greetings, Your Highness." Two women walked side by side from afar. The younger one on the left looked at him and asked, "Brother, did Sir send another letter?" Li Xian looked at Shanning, who had completely lost her innocence and naivety. He smiled and said, "Not only did he send a letter, come and take a look at this." He showed off the sharpness of the dagger in front of Mingzu and Shanning. He said in a boastful tone, "Although this dagger is a little short in terms of sharpness, even the treasures in the palace could not compare to it. It can be called a priceless divine weapon." After saying that, he seemed to have thought of something. He pointed behind him and said, "He brought you a gift too. Go open it." The two women walked over slowly and opened the two long brocade boxes on the table behind him. After being stunned for a while, they turned their heads at the same time and looked at the dagger in Li Xian's hand. Li Xian was stunned. He then smiled and said, "If you like this divine weapon, I can lend it to you for a few days. But remember to return it to me. I still need to use it for research." Shanning closed the brocade box discreetly. She shook her head and said, "It's fine. You're welcome. I will ask him to give you two next time." Li Xian walked over and asked in confusion, "What did he give you?" "It's nothing." Shanning shook her head and picked up the brocade box. She said, "Brother, I still have something to do in the academy. I will leave first. The brocade box was too long. It was at least 4 feet long. When she turned around, she accidentally knocked over the other one. The box landed on the ground. When the lid was opened, the thing inside the box was revealed. It was a long sword. The sword was more than 3 feet long. The hilt of the sword was carved into a lifelike phoenix. The scabbard was carved with complicated patterns. It was unusually exquisite. There was also a row of more than 10 jewels inlaid on it. Under the illumination of the sun, it shone brightly. Li Xian was stunned. He lowered his head and picked up the sword. He seemed to have thought of something. He unsheathed the sword and waved it at the wooden table beside him. Crack! A white light flashed. The wooden table was split into 2 and fell to the side. He looked at the long sword in his hand and the short dagger in his other hand. One was more than 3 feet long, and the other was less than 1 foot long. One of the scabbard was exquisite and inlaid with jewels. It was priceless. The other one did not have a scabbard. It was sent in a wooden box. He suddenly felt a little sad. Chapter 1044. In Jingdo, when the imperial guards of the palace pasted the imperial notices on the city gates and various streets and alleys in conspicuous places, commoners quickly surrounded them. In the early years, it was rare to see imperial notices posted. When the former emperor was on the throne, he only pasted one when he searched for famous doctors to treat a certain princess in the palace. Later, when the current emperor opened a mathematics school, he often posted notices like this to search for craftsmen among the commoners. By now, the commoners were no longer surprised by this. A scholar who passed by had already deciphered the contents of the imperial notice, causing a lot of discussion among the people. This time, the emperor wanted to recruit skilled blacksmiths from all over the Jing kingdom. It was said that food, accommodation, and women would be provided. Those with families would also be given a courtyard in the capital. Apart from that, they would also receive a monthly subsidy from the country. If they were a famous master blacksmith, they might even be able to get a position in the Academy of Sciences. From then on, they would be able to bring glory to their family, reach the sky in a single step, and make their ancestors proud. In short, as long as one had a skill, one would be able to live a good life in the capital city, in the Jing kingdom. Even if one was an old farmer, as long as his land was better than others and his harvest was greater than others, there would still be some officials from the Academy of Sciences who would be willing to call him teacher, and humbly ask him questions. A scholar in a green robe looked at the imperial notice posted on the city wall, then looked at the book he had just bought inside. The book in his hand was this year's imperial examination secret scroll, which he had spent a lot of money and pulled a lot of strings to buy. A blacksmith could get food, accommodation, and marriage services. It was a pity that he had not passed the imperial examination. At the age of coronation, he had not married and had not even touched a woman's hand. It was not that he had not touched a woman's hand. Yesterday, when he was buying vegetables, the auntie who sold vegetables had touched him. Thinking of this, he could not help but feel sad. He threw the book in his hand to the ground and strode away. 10 years of studying hard could not compare to 10 years of forging iron. What was the use of reading such a useless book? After a few steps, he turned around and walked back. He picked up the book on the ground, patted the dust off it, and carefully put it in his pocket. He still had to study. Even if he didn't pass the exam, he would become a blacksmith in the future. Between a blacksmith who had studied and a blacksmith who only knew how to forge iron, there was no need to even think about whose future was brighter. What's more, this thing cost a lot of money. Blacksmith Su was an ordinary blacksmith in the capital. He originally had a name, but his neighbors had been calling him Blacksmith Su, or Blacksmith Su for decades. He couldn't remember how long it had been since someone last mentioned his real name. He had just come back from the city wall, so naturally he had heard the latest news. The spring of blacksmiths that he had been looking forward to was finally here. Carpenter Wang, who lived next door, had entered the Academy of Sciences 2 years ago. Although he was only doing odd jobs for the great craftsman of the Ministry of Works, he had built a 2-story courtyard this year, and arranged a marriage for his silly son. The bride was going to be married this year, and his life was enviable. The old gangster who sold pornography diagonally across the street was also living a comfortable life, because he could tell what people were saying just by looking at their lips. It was said that he was a teacher at the Academy of Sciences, and had a group of disciples. He even boasted that he had taught the current emperor. Blacksmith Su's son was still young, so he wasn't in a hurry to arrange a marriage for him. As a blacksmith, he didn't have the extravagant hope of becoming a teacher for the emperor. All he wanted was to earn more money and let his family of 3 live a more comfortable life. He glanced at his son, who was playing outside the door. He didn't forge iron, but leaned comfortably on the chair and took a sip of the good wine that he had just bought from the tavern. He had already signed up for the recruitment on the imperial notice board, and now he just had to wait for the notification. Outside the door, a few young children were running happily in the streets. Eat my wind god's kick. I know the cloud-splitting palm. I have the snow-guzzling saber. I have the peerless sword. The world of children was always carefree. They weren't old enough to study, so they only thought about eating and playing every day. Sometimes, they would sneak into the brothel to listen to stories. The brothel was the most magical place in their hearts. There were monkeys waving sticks and fighting their way up to the 33 levels of heaven. There were various immortals and gods that they had never heard of. There were also many martial arts masters and heroic deeds of chivalrous heroes. After listening to stories in the brothel, they would play the roles they liked and reenact the stories they had heard. It was a game that they never got tired of. They were acting out a new story in the brothel, which was the plot of Wind and Cloud. Wind god's kick, cloud-splitting palm, snow-guzzling saber, and the peerless sword. Each of them had a dream of being a hero. They wanted to learn the peerless martial arts and help the weak, punish the weak, and fight the evil in the martial world. That was what the stories said. Of course, since he was a chivalrous hero, he needed a suitable weapon, a martial art move that sounded powerful, and a fine horse. The horse had to be beautiful, and it would be best if it was tall and big. Only then would Squire Zhang's son, Zhang Xiaohua, ride the same horse as him. Zhang Xiaohua lived in Zhang Yuanwai's house. He didn't have a horse or a weapon. He didn't know where the sword-worshipping villa that the old grandpa mentioned was. It was said that there were many peerless godly weapons there. If he could get one. Brother, don't be angry. Playing with the dagger in her hand, Shanning looked at Li Xian and said, Master once said that simplicity is beauty. Look at this dagger. It's simple and clean. The scabbard is simple, and the curve of the blade is smooth. Simplicity was beauty. Li Xian naturally understood this principle. However, when Shanning comforted him, she couldn't walk back and forth. She was holding the long sword in her other hand, and the gem on the scabbard was shining so brightly that he couldn't open his eyes. Looking at her serious expression, Li Xian asked, How about we exchange? Shanning was dazed and said in surprise, But brother, this sword is for women. I don't mind, Li Xian looked at her and said, You can have the simple and beautiful dagger. Brother, are you serious? Yes. I won't exchange. After saying that, the pretty woman turned around and left. She walked out of the hall and did not look back even once. Li Xian sat back down and looked at the dagger on the table angrily. He had thought that it was a unique godly weapon. It was indeed unique. Among the 3 gifts he gave, this was the most special, simple, and shabby one. The shortest. He knew that he wouldn't compete with Mingzu to avoid humiliating himself. But Shanning, thinking of the girl just now, forget it, Shanning wouldn't compete with him. He would still be humiliating himself. Thinking of this, he actually felt a little better. Then he opened another letter. Sword Greeting Villa, a batch of peerless godly weapons. After reading the letter, he had a rough idea of what Li Yi wanted to do. If he was a shepherd, then the officials and nobles in the capital were the fat sheep raised by his family. A few years ago, he used the colored glass to make these fat sheep shed a layer of wool. Now that new wool had grown, he was here again. He was the emperor, and those people were his subjects. Although it was easy for them to make money, he couldn't let him fool them again and again. If it weren't for the fact that the Academy of Sciences had several big projects that needed funding, if it weren't for the fact that his second child was about to be born, if it weren't for the fact that Mingzi didn't allow him to squander the money in the national treasury, he would never agree to Li Yi doing this. He walked out of the door and said to a guard, "Tell them that 280 is not enough, at least 370. At the gate of the capital, several carriages came from afar. Before they entered the city, they were stopped by the guards at the gate. One of the generals came forward and asked, "What's in the carriages?" A man smiled and said, "Some goods." "What goods?" The general lifted the black cloth covering the carriages and opened a box. After taking a look, his expression changed. He opened a few more boxes and his expression darkened. He took a few steps back and waved his hand. Seeing this, the guards behind him immediately surrounded the carriages. Only then did the general come forward and ask, "Do you have the seal of the imperial court?" Smuggling weapons was a serious crime, not to mention that there were so many of them. If they didn't have the seal of the imperial court, these people had to be arrested and interrogated immediately. "Of course we do." The leader nodded and took out something that looked like a piece of silk from his sleeve, and handed it over. After carefully examining it, the general waved his hand, and the guards behind him left. The carriages drove through the gate. The general was still a little worried and went forward to ask, "Where did these things come from?" In front of the carriages, the man turned around and said with a smile, "Sword greeting Villa." Chapter 1045. There were two markets in the capital, the East and the West, selling a wide variety of goods. It was the largest market in the vicinity of the Jing Kingdom. Of course, apart from the row upon row of shops and the endless stalls on the streets, there were also all kinds of strange things. For example, a chicken with 3 legs, a bird without legs, a stone man with words on its body, a fox that could talk, and so on. Of course, the imperial court did not allow foxes to talk, and the people were not allowed to dig stones from the river. However, there were still people who laid a piece of white cloth in a corner of the street and sold some valuable antiques that were unknown whether they were real or fake. There were rich people in the capital, and there were also rich people who were interested in these things. The capital's West Market. After the market opened at dawn, the shouting continued until the market closed at night. Glazed statue blessed by Master Sandalwood, 5 taels of silver for 1. The chair that His Highness Jiang of Silla sat on, 100 taels of silver. Selling a knife, a treasured knife passed down from my ancestors, able to cut copper, iron, gold, and jade. The original price is 10,000 taels, now only 5,000 taels, only 5,000 taels. There were all kinds of things for sale on the streets of the capital. A while ago, someone was selling underwear worn by His Highness Jiang of Silla. Later, it was confirmed that it was not Jiang of Silla, and the seller was arrested and sent to prison for fraud. Sometimes, the people would gather around to watch the excitement, to see what was so special about the chair that His Highness Jiang of Silla sat on, to see if the Buddha statue blessed by Master Sandalwood would glow, to see if the treasured knife passed down from my ancestors could cut iron like mud, and so on. A man with a long knife at his waist walked up to the man selling the knife and asked, "This knife of yours, is it really as good as you say?" The man smiled. "A treasured knife is a treasured knife. In front of everyone, if I lie to you, I'll give you 5,000 taels of silver for free." Hearing this, the man smiled, drew out the long knife at his waist, and said, "This knife of mine is just an ordinary one, you can try." The man also drew out the knife in his hand, handed it to him and said, "You can try it yourself." The man looked at him and suddenly said warily, "If I break this saber, you won't ask me to pay for it, right?" "How could that be?" The man shook his head and pointed at the crowd. "Today everyone here is a witness. If my family's treasured saber is broken by this brother, I don't need him to compensate." Seeing this, the man no longer hesitated. He held 2 sabers in each hand and chopped down. Clang! After the sound of metal clashing, the saber that he brought with him broke, but the man's family heirloom saber was not damaged in the slightest. He stared blankly at the broken blade on the ground with a pained expression on his face. He then looked at the man and said, "How dare you sell weapons privately and break my family heirloom? I'm going to arrest you and bring you to the authorities." The Jing Kingdom was very strict with the control of weapons. Without the permission of the government, it was illegal to sell weapons. Of course, the regulations in this area had always been very lax. However, if it was investigated carefully, the man's act of selling knives on the street had indeed violated the law. The man looked at the big man who was stunned on the spot and said, "It's fine if I don't arrest you, unless you compensate me with this knife." The man who sold the saber snatched back the saber and grabbed the man to beat him up. Some of the crowd stayed to watch, while others shook their heads and left. Recently, there were many people selling ancestral treasured sabers and swords on the street. A few days ago, there were even people selling snowguzzler sabers and peerless swords. They had heard too many stories in the brothel and were obsessed. This man actually knew how to use the trick of injuring himself to gain the confidence of others. It was a pity that his appetite was too big. If it was really a divine weapon, it would be worth it. However, there was a 90% chance that it was just a clumsy scam. Among the people who stayed, some of them could not help but come forward to verify it. The man was quite generous and seemed to be very confident in his family heirloom saber. He did not refuse anyone and looked very confident. Gradually, people were surprised to find that this saber seemed to be really unusual. When ordinary sabers came into contact with it, they would either break in two or be cut. Although it could not be said to be able to cut iron like mud, it could really be regarded as a treasured saber. This kind of divine weapon was very popular in the martial arts world. Many rich families in the capital also liked to collect them. In the crowd, a man who looked like a servant looked at the man and said, "The one selling the saber, take your saber and follow me." "All right." The man's face lit up. He immediately put away the saber and followed the servant into a big house. The crowd knew that this man's saber had caught someone's eye. This 5,000 taels of silver was a little too easy to obtain. When the crowd dispersed, another voice came from the crowd. "What family heirloom saber? Didn't you buy it? Didn't you see that the saber is brand new?" "Nonsense. This kind of divine weapon must have been made by a master. How could an ordinary shop buy it? It's the newly opened shop in front. It's called Sword Greeting Villa. It's said that the signboard was personally inscribed by His Majesty. You will know once you take a look. A new weapon shop called Sword Greeting Villa opened in the capital. All the weapons sold were divine weapons. Moreover, the signboard was personally inscribed by His Majesty. It was a guarantee of credibility. A big signboard was erected in front of the shop. Limited stock, first come, first served. The sabers and swords in the shop were all first-rate divine weapons. They were famous for being peerless swords, hero's sword, blazing Qilin sword, snowguzzle saber. Someone came because of the shop's reputation. He used a random saber in the shop to clash with a famous saber made by a master. In the end, the famous saber was chipped while the other was undamaged. Once the news spread, the entire capital was in an uproar. In just a few days, the name Sword Greeting Villa spread throughout the capital. According to the story in the brothel, Sword Greeting Villa had the world's best swordsmithing technique. They could forge divine weapons that could cut through iron like it was mud. Originally, people thought that this was just a made-up story. Now, it seemed that this story was not completely a story. For a period of time, countless nobles and officials who loved collecting rare treasures swarmed over. And the martial artists who longed to own a peerless divine weapon could no longer sit still. It was said that even the current emperor had bought a few of them. In less than 3 days, all the weapons in Sword Greeting Villa were sold out. Even so, there was still an endless stream of people coming to ask about it every day. In the capital, when the door of Sword Greeting Villa was about to be trampled by people, in the faraway Shu state, in the chaotic land, Li was peeling an apple for Zue Mo. Peeling an apple with an ordinary knife was fine. Using a peerless sword to peel an apple would be too conspicuous, and it would easily hurt his hand. After peeling the apple, he wanted to feed it to her personally. Coincidentally, Ruoqing and Rui went in, so he was chased out. Li felt that he was not very popular now. Sometimes, Rui would sleep with Zue Mo, and sometimes Ruoqing would sleep with Zue Mo. Sometimes, the three of them would sleep together, as if he was the only extra. So be it. Having a harmonious family was much better than having a harem on fire. What else could he be dissatisfied with? Li took a bite of the apple, walked back to his room, and picked up a document. Although they were now able to mass-produce the divine weapons in the eyes of the world, there were too many people under them. For a long time, the supply would not be able to meet the demand. Of course, good things should be equipped for their own people first. Except for the batch that was transported to the capital, there was no outflow for the time being. 2 days ago, Li Xian had sent a letter saying that 100 skilled blacksmiths were already on their way. There were too many people who had signed up, so he had even conducted a selection test to select the best 100 blacksmiths and send them over. Li Yi wanted these blacksmiths not only to forge swords. In terms of smelting and forging, they were definitely much better than these laymen. He also hoped that they could take a big step from theory to practice and come up with something more practical. Halfway through eating the apple, he looked up and saw Fong walking over from a distance. His face was a little ugly. He looked at Li Yi and said, "Young master, there is news from the Wu Kingdom. There is news from the Wu Kingdom." Chapter 1046. For the sake of Mississippi Lu's precious disciple, Li Yi had sent people to the Wu Kingdom to gather information a long time ago. During this period of time, news came in one after another. They were all about the stalemate between the forces loyal to the late emperor and the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom. It was neither good nor bad, however, judging from Fong's current expression. It could not be anything good. Li Yi took a letter from him, opened it, and looked at it. The letter said that the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom had secretly recruited several rebel forces. Half a month ago, they besieged Princess Duanrong, who had rebelled. In that battle, the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom won a complete victory. Princess Duanrong's side suffered a crushing defeat. The imperial court reclaimed all the cities they had seized. As for Princess Duanrong, her whereabouts were still unknown. Unknown meant that the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom had not found her. This was the silver lining in the misfortune. Li looked at Fong and asked, "Does Rui know about this?" Rui was not in the stockade. She had returned a few days ago. She should still be busy subduing the other forces in the fringe. Fong nodded and said, "I've already sent someone to deliver the news. She should know soon." Li rubbed the space between his brows and said helplessly, "Go find her." Immediately. Second Miss Lu had become a lot gentler. She wouldn't retaliate even if she was spanked. She was like a completely different person from before. However, there was something else in her character that wouldn't change easily. Back then, she had traveled thousands of miles to find her brother-in-law. She had chased him from the capital to Shuzhou, then from Shuzhou to the Qi Kingdom. She had rescued him from the hands of Taoist nun. After learning that Yang Liuqing's fate was unknown, she might have run from the fringe to the Wu Kingdom to find her only disciple. If he and Rui were not by her side, no one could stop her. Li Yi did not object to Rui's search for Yang Liuqing. After all, she was already half a member of the Li family after spending so much time together. Just based on the fact that she called him martial aunt, Li Yi would not sit idly by and watch her get into trouble. He and Rui did not blame her for leaving without saying goodbye. She had too many burdens on her shoulders, such as the hatred of her country and family. Even so, she did not bend her spine. It could only be said that Rui had an incredible disciple, and he had an incredible martial nephew. But no matter how many experts the Lu Alliance had, no matter how good their weapons were, they would not be able to fight against a country. So he needed to stop Rui in time when she was impulsive, so that he could make a long-term plan. After saying goodbye to Rui and the others, Li Yi, Fong, and Su set off immediately. There was no need to bring too many people. The elites and core disciples of the Alliance were by Rui's side. Fong was there to watch the fun, and Su was there to deal with all kinds of unexpected situations. He only hoped that when they arrived, Mississippi Lu would not be so impulsive. In the Wu Kingdom, in the imperial capital, a eunuch gently knocked on the door of a luxurious palace and pushed it open. Inside the palace, there were bookshelves on both sides, and the bookshelves were densely packed with books. Right in front of them was a table, and behind the table sat a figure. The eunuch bowed to the ground and asked respectfully, "Your Majesty, those rebels have arrived in the imperial capital. General Cheng asked me to ask Your Majesty, how should we deal with them?" The figure behind the table put down the book in his hand and said, "Since they are rebels, General Cheng should know how to deal with them. There's no need to ask me about such a small matter." "Yes, Your servant will reply to General Cheng now. Your servant will take his leave. The eunuch bowed again, and was about to turn around and leave. Is there any news about Qing and Fuer? Before he walked out of the palace, the figure behind the table spoke again. The eunuch turned around and bowed again. Your Majesty, General Cheng said that this time, we will definitely deal with these two rebels. Shut up. A reprimanding voice suddenly came from inside the palace. Looking at the figure behind the table who stood up, the eunuch's face immediately turned pale. He knelt on the ground and said anxiously, Your Majesty, please spare my life. Your Majesty, please spare my life. Although they took the wrong path, they are still the princess and prince of the Wu Kingdom. How can a slave like you impose the word rebels on them? A skinny young man walked over from the front. His long and narrow eyes glanced at the eunuch, and he said in a low voice, Go and receive your punishment. Don't do it again. Thank you, Your Majesty. Thank you, Your Majesty. The eunuch hurriedly kowtowed. Get up. The skinny young man waved his hand and asked, Is there any news about them? After the eunuch stood up, he immediately replied, Your Majesty, General Cheng said that he has already found traces of Princess Duanrong and Prince Jing. At most, he will be able to bring them back in a month. Tell him that they must not be harmed. Bring Qing and Fuer back safely. If even a strand of their hair is harmed, I will hold him responsible. Yes, Your Majesty, I will definitely bring Your Majesty's message to General Cheng. The skinny young man waved his hand and said, All right, you can leave now. After the eunuch left, the skinny young man turned around with one hand behind his back. Only then did he realize that there was another person in the palace. It was an old man with white hair and beard. At this moment, he was sitting on the seat that the skinny young man had just sat on. This was the imperial study, a seat that only the emperor could sit on. However, the young man was not angry or annoyed. Instead, he slowly walked forward and asked with a smile, Imperial uncle, why do you have time to come here today? The old man raised his head to look at him, and a sliver of disappointment appeared in his murky eyes. He said, The blood that flows in the three of you is the blood of the royal family. You've already killed too many people. Just let these two children go. They can't threaten your throne. What you should do is to flatten the rebellious forces and return peace to the world as soon as possible. The young man was startled. Then he sighed and said, Grand uncle, you still don't believe me. Back then, father and brother were suspicious. I kept retreating, and retreating again and again. In the end, I really couldn't retreat anymore. If I didn't protect myself, I wouldn't be standing here talking to Grand Uncle. How do you expect me to believe you? The old man stood up and looked at him. He asked, I only traveled outside for half a year. After I returned to the imperial capital, you killed my brother, murdered my father, and forced my mother to death. Half of the officials in the imperial court died, and another half ran away. The border army rebelled, and another 3 provinces rebelled. How do you expect me to believe you? Whether what happened back then was right or wrong, whether Imperial Uncle is willing to believe me or not, I don't want to mention it again. The young man turned around and walked into the hall. He said, Now our Wu Kingdom is in a deep quagmire. The 2 kings of the Qi Kingdom are fighting for power. However, the Jing Kingdom is developing rapidly and suppressing all the other countries. I will suppress the chaos in the Wu Kingdom as soon as possible. I also hope that Imperial Uncle can consider the overall situation and think for the sake of the Wu Kingdom. If I didn't think for the sake of the Wu Kingdom, I would have killed you with my palm. The old man walked past him and said calmly, I don't care about the suppression of the rebellion. I don't want to look into what happened in the past. But I only warn you. Don't do anything to those 2 children again. Don't force me to do it. His last words were still echoing in the young man's ears. Then he disappeared. Suppress the rebels and restore peace to the world. But what if they are the rebels? The young man looked out of the door and murmured in a low voice, Warn me? I am the emperor. Why should I be warned? Who else can warn me? A hint of gloominess appeared on his face. He clenched his fists tightly in his sleeves. His nails dug deep into his flesh. Chapter 1047. In a mansion somewhere in the imperial capital of the Wu Kingdom, several figures were sitting in the courtyard, talking in low voices. Behind them were dozens of other figures. They were the elite subordinates who had entered the imperial capital with them. What do you think they will bestow upon us this time? It shouldn't be a small one. If it weren't for us, they wouldn't have been able to defeat Princess Duanrong so easily. General Cheng has already gone to the palace to ask. There should be news soon. This world is really mysterious. At first I wanted to be a thief, but as I did so, I actually became an official. I never dreamed that I, Big Head Ma, would be able to wear the hat of an official for the rest of my life. The few of them were all rebels. After the Wu Kingdom fell into chaos a few years ago, they rose up in revolt and proclaimed themselves kings. A few days ago, they were recruited by the imperial court and worked together with the imperial court to defeat another powerful rebel army. This time, they had come to the capital to receive their rewards and be promoted to officials. As they were talking, someone suddenly knocked on the door. Immediately, someone stood up and said with a smile, "Could it be that General Cheng has returned?" He personally went to open the door and saw the familiar face of General Cheng. "Haha, General Cheng, from now on we are colleagues." Puff! Before he could finish speaking, his body suddenly trembled. He lowered his head to look at a spear that had pierced through his chest. Blood flowed from the corner of his mouth as he looked at the man in front of him and said in pain, "You." The man calmly pulled out the spear and then waved his hand. "Release the arrows." Rows of archers immediately swarmed in. In the courtyard, there were endless curses and screams. "Cheng, you didn't keep your promise. I won't let you off even if I become a ghost. What are you doing? We're on the same side. We're on the same side." In the land of chaos, near the top of a mountain in the Wu Kingdom, a man with a dignified appearance was pacing back and forth in the hall. There was a hint of anxiety on his face. "Report." A figure quickly rushed in from the entrance of the fort. After rushing in, he knelt on one knee and said loudly, "Reporting to General Wei, Her Highness was ambushed by the imperial court in Lin province. Fortunately, she has successfully escaped and will be here soon." The man's face darkened, and he immediately said, "Chen Qing, you will personally lead 500 men to receive His Highness." Behind him a man knelt on one knee and bowed. "Understood." The other man hesitated for a moment before asking, "General, sending 500 people at the same time is too big of a commotion. If the Wan brothers find out, I'm afraid." The middle-aged man's face darkened. The Wan brothers were a group of bandits dozens of miles away from this place. They had a large number of people and were extremely powerful. In the past few years, there had been occasional friction between the two sides. If the other side took advantage of the situation and attacked, it would be a big problem. He thought for a moment, then shook his head and said, "Your Highness's safety is more important." Chen Qing set off immediately. At this moment, a weak voice suddenly sounded in everyone's ears. The messenger pursed his lips, looked at them, and said, "General, the Wan brothers, they..." Immediately, someone's expression changed and he asked, "Could it be that they're making a move again?" The messenger shook his head and said after a while, "The Wan brothers, they..." Someone couldn't hold it in any longer and said angrily, "What happened to them? Tell us." "They're repairing the road." The guard general was startled and frowned, asking, "Repairing the road?" The messenger looked up at him and nodded, saying, "Our spies saw it with their own eyes. Not only the Wan brothers, but also the Black Blind of the Twin Forks Ridge, the Mountain Patrol Tiger of the White Tiger Ravine." He pointed out the names of several famous bandit leaders in the vicinity, swallowed his saliva, and said, "They are all repairing roads. The Wan brothers, the Black Blind, the Mountain Patrol Tiger." These people he had just mentioned were originally the bandits of the Wu Kingdom. In the early years, they were just a small group of bandits roaming the border provinces. Later on, the country was in turmoil, and some people gathered a huge force to form a separatist regime. In a small area, they were able to stand up to the imperial court. There were also people like the Wan brothers. Their strength was neither strong nor weak. They couldn't stand up to the imperial court, and were unwilling to submit to other major forces, so they simply fled into the land of chaos, occupied a mountain, and proclaimed themselves as kings. Over the years, they grew stronger like a rolling snowball, and had long become the overlords of the mountain. They often left the mountain to plunder the common people and caravans. The guard general wanted to eliminate them, but they were powerless. Anyone would find it strange that such bandits would suddenly stop plundering and run off to do something as mindless as repairing roads. Someone seemed to recall something and said, "General, I heard that 2 years ago, a new force rose in the Jing Kingdom. They had extraordinary strength and forcefully opened up the trade road connecting the Jing Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom. They swept away all the bandits along the road and escorted the traveling caravans and pedestrians. The bandits they subdued were all forced to pave the road and repair the bridge." The guard general looked at him and asked, "You're saying that those people have already come here and subdued the Wan brothers, the Black Blind, and the Mountain Patrol Tiger at the same time, making these overlords personally pave the road for them and open up the trade road? Apart from this, I can't think of any other reason. Let's not talk about whether they came to the Wu Kingdom or not. Subduing the Wan brothers, the Black Blind, and the Mountain Patrol Tiger at the same time. Do you think there's such a powerful force in the land of chaos?" The guard general shook his head and said, "No matter what the Wan brothers are up to, let's first bring the princess and His Highness King Jing here safely. Then we'll think about it." The man looked at the guard general in silence for a moment before he said, "General, what I mean is, if they really subdued the Wan brothers, the next one will be us. What does this have to do with us?" The guard general frowned again and asked, "We have no problem with them subduing bandits, but we are not bandits. Why would they attack us? Do they really think the land of chaos is their territory?" Dozens of miles away, on the mountain road, a dark mass of people were busy on the mountain road. Behind them, there was a long gray mountain road. A bald man stepped hard on the mountain road. After confirming that there was no problem with the quality, he continued to walk forward. He thought to himself, this thing called cement is really useful. It's much more convenient than quarrying stones from the mountains to pave the road. On a nearby mountain top, a young man looked at the woman in front of him with a respectful gaze and said, "Leader, this is news from the Wu Kingdom. After the rebel army was defeated, Princess Duanrong disappeared. The Wu Kingdom's imperial court is also trying hard to find her." After reading the news, Mississippi Lu was silent for a moment before she said, "Send a letter to the stronghold. Tell them that I will return after a while. Leave the matters here to Lu Luo for the time being. Where are you going?" A voice came from outside the door. When the young man saw the 3 people walking in, he cupped his hands and immediately retreated. Mississippi Lu looked at them and asked, "Why are you here?" Li found a chair and sat down. He said, "If we didn't come, we would have gone to the Wu Kingdom to look for you in a few days." Li Yi was somewhat glad that he had rushed over as soon as possible. If he had been a day and a half later, he might have had to follow Rui's example and chase after his sister-in-law. Mississippi Lu looked at him and said seriously, "I can't leave her alone." Li nodded and said, "I didn't ask you to leave her alone. I just want to tell you not to be impulsive. It's impossible to save her from the hands of the Wu Kingdom's imperial court by yourself, or with the help of Lu Meng. We have to think about it at length. We? Don't forget, she's also my martial niece." Mississippi Lu finally nodded. Seeing his travel-worn appearance, she asked, "Are you hungry? I'll cook a bowl of noodles for you first." Fong rubbed his stomach and looked at her. He asked, "Second miss, can you cook another bowl?" "Ahem." The sloppy old man coughed softly. Fong looked at him and said, 3 bowls. Chapter 1048. The conditions in the mountains were harsh. Unlike in the stockade village, they couldn't eat delicacies here. They could only eat noodle soup with a few green vegetables floating on top. Even so, Li still ate with relish. Only now did he realize that he had misunderstood Rui. She was not unruly and unreasonable. She could be brutal and violent, gentle and virtuous, proud and charming, and domineering. Marrying a girl like her was equivalent to marrying several at the same time. God was really kind to him. Old Fong was also eating happily. He had truly lived a hard life, so he never haggled over what he ate. The sloppy old man didn't care either. In his eyes, there was only Wu Dao and second granduncle, and perhaps Changda and the Taoist nun he had been longing for a long time. After eating and drinking to their heart's content, it was time to get down to business. Whether it was Mississippi Lu alone, or with the elites of the Lu League, it was not a good idea to rashly enter the Wu Kingdom to look for Yangliuking. The Wu Kingdom was a little smaller than the Jing Kingdom, but not by much. Without any clues, it would take them forever to search for Yangliuking like headless flies. It was better to stay put. Instead of looking for a needle in a haystack, it was better to continue to subdue the forces in the fringe while waiting for news. There were many people in the Wu Kingdom who were more eager to find Yangliuking than they were. There was no doubt about that. Moreover, there was news from the Wu Kingdom that the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom didn't care about her life and death. They ordered the local authorities to capture her alive. In this case, there was no need to be anxious. He just needed to be the fisherman who reaped the benefits in the end. This was what he liked to do the most. Mississippi Lu was not stubborn. After Li Yi analyzed all the pros and cons for her, she was not so impulsive anymore. Li Yi looked at her and said, "Don't worry, once there is news from the Wu Kingdom, we will immediately take the elites of the Lu League to rescue her. As long as she is not imprisoned in the Imperial Palace, we will be able to rescue her. As for the Wu Kingdom, we will send more spies to gather information." In fact, even if she was locked up in the palace, it was not impossible to rescue her, but it would be more troublesome and dangerous. She could not torment second granduncle all day. Mississippi Lu looked at him and asked, "Are we just going to wait like this now?" Li Yi pondered for a moment and said, "If you're bored, you can first unite the fringe. There aren't many strongholds left, right?" Mississippi Lu nodded. "Not much." General Wei slowly paced around the room with his hands behind his back, murmuring, "What the hell are the Wan brothers doing?" A trace of doubt appeared on his face, but he quickly shook his head and stopped thinking about it. The most important thing now was to ensure the safety of Her Royal Highness. Once they entered the chaotic lands, the soldiers wouldn't be able to do anything to them. A momentary failure didn't mean everything. As long as the princess and Imperial Prince Jing were safe, they would have a chance to restore order and pull the traitor who killed his brother and father off the throne. At this moment, a young man rushed in from outside. He was panting heavily and looked extremely terrified. He shouted, General Wei, bad news, bad news." General Wei's expression changed. He immediately asked, "Did something happen to Her Royal Highness and King Jing?" "No." The young man shook his head and said with difficulty, "General, it's them, they're here." "Them?" General Wei strode forward and asked, "Who are they?" In front of the stronghold, a bald man held a conical paper tube and shouted, "Listen up, people inside you." He scratched his bald head. This was the first time he shouted. He was so nervous that he forgot what he was supposed to say. A trace of embarrassment appeared on his face. The next moment he raised the paper tube and continued to shout, "Put down your weapons and surrender. Those who obey me will prosper. Those who oppose me will perish." Behind him, there was a dense mass of people. In front of the crowd, Mississippi Lu tilted her head and looked at Li Yi. She said, "This is the last one." Li Yi looked at the stronghold in front of him. In the past few months, Mississippi Lu had led the Lu League's elite forces and swept through the entire fringe. The bandits they encountered would either escape as soon as they heard the news and escape from the fringe. Those who put up a stubborn resistance would be beaten into submission and dispersed to various places to build new structures. The progress bar was almost full. After sweeping the last wave of bandits, she would be the true king of bandits in the fringe. Mission objective: become the king of bandits. Mission progress: 99%. The bald man was still holding the paper tube and shouting, "I'll give you 30 minutes to think about it. If you don't surrender, we'll attack." There was no movement in the stronghold for a long time. When the incense stick was about to burn out, the stronghold gate slowly opened. A man with an upright face walked out from inside. He was dressed in plain clothes, but his gait was majestic and imposing. There was a faint aura that Li Yi was very familiar with. Behind him, dozens of archers had drawn their bows and pointed their arrows at the group of bandits. Li Yi was a little puzzled. Looking at their formation, They didn't look like bandits. Instead, they looked like soldiers. No one made a sound. The atmosphere was extremely solemn. The middle-aged man didn't look at the bald man. He looked around and looked at Li Yi and Mississippi Lu. He asked, "We have no grudge against you. Why are you forcing us to this extent?" Just now, he seemed to have heard the bandit leader's subordinates call him general. They did not even pay attention to the organization, and actually copied the military. How could he be a good bandit? The middle-aged man's hands were tied behind his back, but his back was still straight. A baldy stood beside him, and as he swayed he asked, "Tell me honestly, what's your name, where do you live, how many people are in your family, are you married?" The middle-aged man looked at him, but did not speak. The baldy poked his chest and frowned. "I'm asking you a question, be honest." "Son-in-law, second miss, there's still one more." Fong walked in from the outside with a man in his hand. The man was floating in the air, waving his hands and feet randomly while shouting, "What are you doing? Are you crazy? I have something important to report to General Wei." When he looked up and saw that familiar figure, he immediately said, "General Wei, it's not good. Her Highness the Princess is surrounded by the Imperial Army in the Thorns Ridge. Deputy General Chun and 500 soldiers are fighting with their lives on the line. I'm afraid they won't be able to hold on for long." Before he finished speaking, he widened his eyes, looking at the General Wei who was tied up like a fried dough twist. "General, what is he playing at?" Li Yi looked at him, and after being startled for a while he asked, "What princess?" The man glared at him and said angrily, "Are you stupid? Of course it's Princess Duanrong." Chapter 1049. Princess Duanrong. Li Yi and Mississippi Lu looked at each other, then shifted their gaze to the man and asked, "What did you just say? Say it again." "Shut up." The tied-up middle-aged man glared at the man, breathing rapidly, and his eyes almost popping out of their sockets. He began to struggle strenuously. The rope on his body rubbed red marks on his exposed skin. No matter how slow the man who was brought over by Fong was, he knew that General Wei was tied up like this, and was definitely not playing some indescribable game. Looking at Li Yi and Mississippi Lu, he said with a trembling voice, You, who are you?" Li Yi looked at the middle-aged man and shook his head. "Don't waste your energy. The more you struggle, the tighter the rope is." He didn't know who had just tied the rope in such a shameful way. He looked at Lao Fong and said, "Untie him." As soon as the rope was untied, the middle-aged man suddenly rushed out of the village. Of course, he was stopped by Fong. He lowered his voice and roared, "Let me go, I have something important to do. When I come back, you can do whatever you want to me." "What's the use of going alone? Are you going to die?" Li Yi looked at him and said indifferently before asking, "The princess he mentioned just now, is it Princess Duanrong of the Wu Kingdom, Yangliuking?" The middle-aged man no longer struggled and looked at Li Yi with a burning gaze. "How do you know the princess' name?" Li Yi signaled Fong to let him go with his eyes. Mississippi Lu had already walked to the side, and was whispering something to Bai Su, who had a small chest. Li Yi looked at the baldy beside him and said, "Let them all go." The middle-aged man stood in a daze. He had experienced several ups and downs in a short period of time. Even if his mind was extremely firm, he still couldn't calm down for a while. Fong patted his shoulder and comforted him. "Don't be nervous, we're on the same side." Thorns Ridge. The Thorns Ridge was located at the border of the Wu Kingdom, and several dozen kilometers deeper into the Thorns Ridge was a chaotic land without jurisdiction. The nearby civilians and merchants wouldn't easily set foot there. Thorns Ridge, somewhere in the forest. The deputy general named Chen Qing wiped away the blood on his forehead and said in a hoarse voice, "Princess, I will lead 200 men tonight, and we will fight our way out. When the time comes, we will stop them while the rest of us will escort you and His Highness King Jing to the north. Once we reach the fringe, we will meet up with General Wei, and they won't be able to do anything to you too." Opposite him was a young woman with disheveled hair and bloodstains on her body. However, there was no fear on her face. Her gaze was sharp as she shook her head and said, "Tonight's surprise attack, everyone retreat with me." "Princess." Chun-Ching looked at him and said in a deep voice, "We have been forced to this point, and there is no way out. This general hopes that your highness will not be stubborn, and will look at the bigger picture. Imperial sister, I don't want to die, I don't want to die." A 13 or 14-year-old youngster staggered over, wiped his tears and cried, "Let's surrender. They won't kill me if we surrender. I don't want to die." Yang Liuqing looked at him with a complicated expression, but didn't say anything. Chun-Ching looked at the youngster before him, clenched his teeth and said, "Your Highness King Jing, surrendering is useless, they won't let us go." A trace of resentment suddenly appeared on the youngster's face. He pointed at him and loudly said, "It's all your fault, it's all your fault. If you hadn't killed so many of their people, they definitely wouldn't have killed us." "Shut up." Yang Liuqing finally couldn't help but berate. He looked left and right and said, "Take him away." When the two guards carried him away, he was still flailing his arms and legs, shouting, "Imperial sister, I don't want to die. I don't want to die, save me, save me." When the youngster's voice could no longer be heard, Yang Liuqing looked at Chun-Ching and asked, "What's the situation at the foot of the mountain?" Chun-Ching pondered for a moment, and said, "They are now temporarily stationed at the foot of the mountain. They sent a letter up, saying that as long as we surrender, they won't hurt your highnesses. The deadline is tomorrow morning, and if we don't surrender by tomorrow morning, they will attack. They won't hurt." Yang Liuqing looked at the setting sun in the sky and said, "Based on second brother's character, I don't think he will let us go. He can't wait to kill all the princes. How could he let your highnesses go?" An old figure walked over, lightly coughed twice and said, "Let's do as General Chen said. We will force our way out tonight, and your highness will bring King Jing to the fringe to meet General Wei." "Prime Minister." The old man waved his hand and interrupted her. "As long as your highness and King Jing are safe, we still have a chance." "Chun-Ching," he suddenly shouted in a low voice. "Yes, General." "Arrange for our men to attack the foot of the mountain tonight, and escort your highnesses out of here." "Yes, Prime Minister." Chun-Ching turned and left without looking back. They still had 300 men who could fight. If they forced their way out, there was still a glimmer of hope. After Chun-Ching left, the old man looked at the forest in the distance, which was gradually disappearing into the darkness, and suddenly said, "Your Highness, if you can escape this time, don't come back." Yang Liuqing looked at him, her lips slightly parted and said, "Prime Minister." The old man stretched out his hand and lightly pressed down, signaling her to stop talking. Then he said again, "King Jing is useless. This heavy responsibility should not fall on your Highness' shoulders. Your Highness, go to the Qi Kingdom, go to the Jing Kingdom, forget about the Wu Kingdom, forget about the hatred, forget about Princess Duanrong and live a normal life." Yang Liuqing shook her head and said, "I once swore that if I can't avenge my father, my mother, and my brother, I am not a human. After all, we have nothing left." The old man sighed and said, "The Jing Kingdom is like the sun at noon, growing stronger day by day. The third prince of the Qi Kingdom has the heart to be the ruler of the world, and he also has the ability to govern the country. Yang Zhe killed his brother and father, and it is intolerable. Perhaps the Wu Kingdom is doomed, but the people are pitiful." Yang Liuqing lowered her head, clenched her fists and gritted her teeth and said, "I will not give up." The old man looked at her, and a trace of tenderness appeared in his eyes. Finally he shook his head, sighed, and turned to leave. Yang Liuqing stood where she was for a long time. She clenched her fists so tightly that her nails had sunk deep into her palms. She looked up at the round moon in the sky, and her face was full of determination. But behind this unswerving determination, there was a deeply hidden weakness and helplessness. If it was possible, why would she be willing to shoulder such a deep blood feud? Why would she be willing to shoulder such a heavy responsibility that was suffocating her? Why wouldn't she want to be an ordinary woman? How she wanted to be an ordinary woman. Tomorrow would be the 15th. 3 years ago, she didn't have to face all the things she had to face today. She could still live in that small courtyard. The courtyard that carried almost all the happiness of her life. In that small courtyard, there was her Shifu who was strict but spared no effort in teaching her to be cold on the outside but warm on the inside. There was her uncle Master Li Yi, who was very lazy but never stumped by anything. There was also her gentle and virtuous uncle Master Rui, who had already reached the peak of martial arts. And there was also the innocent, silly but kind Miss Xiaohuan. That small courtyard and everything about Lu Meng were things that she could never let go of and forget in this lifetime. How were they now? When she left, Uncle Master Rui was pregnant. The child should be almost 3 years old now. She didn't know if it was a boy or a girl. Was Uncle Master Li Yi still so afraid of Shifu? She didn't know how his relationship with Miss Ruoqing and Miss Zuamo was. She didn't know if Shifu still often bullied Uncle Master. She also didn't know if Shifu had won against Princess Emingzu. She also didn't know if Shifu still blamed her until now. She turned her head and looked in a certain direction. She knew that they were now in Shuzhou, a chaotic place away from here. But this was a distance that she would never be able to cross in this lifetime. At the foot of the Thorns Ridge, figures were swaying and countless flames were blazing. At the forefront of the crowd, 2 generals on horseback were looking at the pitch-black mountain road. One of them turned his head and said, "General, we still have to wait for a night. Why don't we let them camp here first?" "No need." The man beside him waved his hand and said, "Attack at midnight." "Attack at midnight?" The man was startled and asked in disbelief. "But didn't His Majesty give an imperial edict that the princess and King Jing cannot be hurt?" "I don't know what imperial edict." The man in armor grinned and said in a low voice, "I only know that His Majesty wrote in the secret letter, 'Leave no one alive.'" You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.